conservation biologist and the real boss at the Utah Lake Authority, Addy.
Okay, everyone bear with me today as I MC. I did it last year, and hopefully this year goes a little better. So I'm super excited to be here today. Again, this is definitely our more technical day, which I'm excited for. I know most of the fellow scientists in here are. So if you guys have any questions, we are going to be doing it panel style today. So if you see on our agenda, our first one is mainly fisheries management. So each person is going to give their presentation, and then once they finish, they're going to be able to sit up here. So the first one we are going to have up is Maura Borden, and she is going to talk a little bit more in depth about the carp management efforts that went on this year. So we're super excited to hear from her. And then once you're done with your presentation, please feel free to sit down. I think this thing died, or is dying, potentially. But once you're done, you can sit down, and then I'll pull up the next presentation, so you shouldn't have to worry about it. All right. Woo.
All right, hello everyone. I'm Maura Borden, and this summer I was in charge of carp. So if you saw the presentation yesterday, this is going to look somewhat familiar, but today I'll be getting more into the technical side of it, what the science we gathered means for the future, and all that good stuff. So just brief background, carp are an invasive species on Utah Lake. You all probably know this, but they've caused a lot of damage for the June sucker, for sport fish, for water quality, and just general beauty of the lake. Historically, carp management was done primarily with large-scale seines that were pulled through the water column, and this work was contracted out to Loy Fisheries. And they did a good job for a long time. They got a lot of carp out of the lake, but over time, effectiveness of that process did decrease. So this summer, it was decided a new method should be explored, and that method was baited trap nets. So these nets and the gear we used this summer were rented by a Minnesota-based company, Carp Solutions, and they came out with us in June to help show us the ropes and get things set up. We set 6 total nets around Utah Lake, 2 in the Delta, 2 on the lakeshore, and 2 in Provo Bay. You're probably going to be like, hey, Maura, there's 8 dots on that map. That's because 2 of the nets had to move throughout the season, but for the most part, they stayed put, and with some maintenance, got to stay where they were all season. These nets were 30 by 60 feet, and they were baited with cracked corn to bring the carp into the site. It took about 2 weeks for the carp to fully find the corn, but once they did, they were eating about 150 pounds per day. So a lot of corn went into the lake this summer. In addition to our nets, we had some pit tag readers as well. We had 2, and 1 was set in Provo Bay, 1 in the Delta. So front off of the season, we were tagging a whole bunch of carp. We tagged a total of 307, and we were keeping an eye on those pit tag readers to get to see the trends of when the carp were in the net. Every 15 minutes, we were returned a graph kind of like this from Carp Solutions, and this was super useful to us. On the x-axis, you'll see time. On the y, unique pit tags. So every day, we would get to see what the carp were doing. Because of gear malfunction, this was mostly used as like a trend to see when we should be tripping the nets. But it was also occasionally when things were working, we used it to be like, there's carp in the net right now, we better trip right now. So that was pretty cool and very promising for the future. Tripping the nets themselves was something we typically did twice a day on days we were tripping nets. We would be about 200 feet from the net, and we would press a button that would spin a mechanism dropping a counterweight and raising the walls of the trap. And whatever carp were in the net at that time were then bring a boom under the lead line of the net, bring the carp closer and closer to the boat until there was a purse of fish right by the boat. Imagine 2,000 to 6,000 pounds of carp right next to the boat, all splashing. We'd connect the crane to this lead line of the net, bring the carp up level with the boat, and then the rest was on us. We would stand on the boat and haul the carp over the edge. And then you'd see a picture something like this. We would grab all of the tagged carp out of the net, the ones that had those pit tags in them, and we'd scan them and release them back into the lake so we could continue using them to see when they were in the net. We'd also remove any bycatch we caught. We only got channel cats, bullheads, and white bass in large numbers. We actually only got one June sucker all year, so good news there. No June suckers really come to our nets. We would weigh and measure bycatch and then release it back into the lake just so the sport fish populations weren't being reduced by our efforts to take carp out. And once everything was out of the boat that needed to be, we'd take our carp to our processing site. We'd load up these white brailer bags, and we would take this telehandler and put all of the carp in a dump trailer, which we would take out of the lake take out of the state park every couple days so things didn't get too stinky. All right, troubleshooting. This was a pilot project, year 1 of 2, as I mentioned, so we got a whole bunch of troubleshooting as you would expect. We had boats break down, we had equipment go in the lake. You'll see our pit tag box. So going forward, we learned a lot, and this will definitely help with next season going smoother. Despite all these setbacks, we did get nearly 6,000 carp, and that was 40,000 pounds. So a whole bunch of carp out of Utah Lake, promising results for the first year. We tripped nets 41 times, and of all of the fish we caught, only 7% were non-target. So very few overall bycatch, which was good to see. So what did we learn overall from this process this season? We learned that sight has an impact on how many carp we can catch. On the y-axis, you'll see carp captures. So at different sites, we had different levels of carp we could anticipate catching per net. And going forward, we're gonna use those best sites as the ones we'll be using again next year. A huge takeaway from this season was also time of day is huge when it comes to tripping nets. So when we did night trips, this was typically midnight, 10 p.m. through midnight, we would get the most carp by a landslide. And next season, we want to make it so we're only doing night trips and getting as many carp as we possibly can. We didn't get any trips between midnight and 6 a.m., just didn't have the personnel to run that type of operation, but next season that would be a good thing to investigate. But from what we gathered, night tripping is definitely the way to go. Temperature also played an important role in how many carp we captured. The general trend being a little warmer tends to lead to more carp. There's a bit of a sweet spot there because if it gets too warm, then we're not seeing as many carp caught. Now, we're not going to be able to control the temperature of the lake, but what we can control is the months that we're tripping nets. So we'll be doing summer months and early fall to try to get those warmer temperatures and get the carp out of the lake with this process. And the last variable we found to significantly impact carp captured is continuous bait days. So we would not be baiting over the weekend, and the carp took a moment to find the net find the corn once we started baiting again. We found that at least 2 bait days was most effective. The trend is more is better. I'm sure that wouldn't continue infinitely, but we're gonna work it into the schedule next year to have at least 2 bait days after the weekend to make sure the carp are finding that corn before we start tripping the net. This all plays out looking forward into 2025 and continuing this pilot project with our new insights and new knowledge to try to get a good read on what an optimal season is gonna look like. So this season, we did get some really good hauls, but with all our learning curve and the setbacks we experienced, we don't really have an optimal idea of what this could look like long term. So next season, we're gonna try to get that, and with data from this season and next season, we're gonna evaluate if this is an effective method going forward, and if this should be something we continue to do in the lake to remove carp. The 3 main things we're going to do is set our nets in high yield sites, trip at night, and trip at least 2 continuous days after the weekend before we start, or bait before we start tripping. This is all worked into the schedule so that we're gonna get as many carp as we possibly can and continue working towards an optimal carp management strategy. I have a lot of thank yous I owe this season. I got a lot of great help. All of our partners at the June Sucker Recovery and Implementation Program were essential in this project, getting funding, setting up things early season, and being great support throughout the season. Carp Solutions created some really awesome gear that they also gave us great insight in using when they came out and throughout the season. And a special thanks to my team this summer. I could not have done it without you guys, and it was a pleasure working with you all. I want to leave you all with this. the enemy, common carp, will get them. And I really appreciate you all's time and for being such a great audience.
All right, thanks, Maura. That was great. I think that was a great expansion on yesterday's slides, for sure. All right. And then next up, we are going to have Tim Walsworth out of Utah State University talking about how we take that data and make something useful out of it.
Morning, everybody. Thanks for coming out. Yeah, so as Addy mentioned, my name is Tim Walsworth. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Watershed Sciences at Utah State University, and along with my colleagues, Kevin Landom, Ellie Wallace, we've been assessing the carp population using the data from UDWR and the Loy fisheries for since 2018. So as Maura mentioned, carp, one of the world's worst invasive species. They're introduced in Utah Lake in the 1880s to support a fishery. So they're introduced as a food fish. And they quickly took over the lake, and by the 2000s, they accounted for over 90% of the fish biomass in the lake. And in being so abundant and so down in the lake, they had some negative ecosystem effects on habitats within the lake that are thought to hinder June sucker recovery, particularly by reducing the availability of juvenile rearing habitat in submerged aquatic vegetation. So the June sucker recovery implementation program implemented carp control efforts in the lake starting in 2009, and these efforts started out with mechanical removal of carp using large commercial seines by Loy fisheries, and over 13,000 tons of carp have been removed from the lake since the onset of this effort. So they're removing lots and lots of fish over the years, but it's important to remember when we think about these amounts, removing carp is not the goal. Reducing carp biomass is actually the goal. So seeing how that removal of carp actually affects the long-term biomass in the lake is really important, and that's the goal of our analysis. So we've asked over the years, how has the carp population responded to historical removal efforts, and have we achieved biomass targets? And we did this using a statistical catch-at-age model where we took data from Loy fisheries, so looking at how much biomass they harvested per haul, as well as we do standardized seine surveys every year where we sample the same habitats every year all around the lake to get an estimate of the density of carp by age in the lake. And using that, we can determine how many carp there are in the population and how it changed through time. So, where is the figure? There's supposed to be a figure here. Did not get sent over. Okay, we're gonna interpretive dance this one then. So the carp biomass declined towards the target through 2017 and remained near the target biomass, or the target biomass being 75% less than the 2009 biomass estimate. So it declined towards that target through 2017, stayed there through about 2019, and then began increasing again. And it slowly recovered to a level that's about 2/3 of the starting biomass, and it's kind of stayed about the same level since about 2001. So the carp are estimated still to be well below where they started in biomass, but above that target. So what challenges has the carp control effort faced? So what allowed that recovery to happen? Okay, great, these showing up. So one challenge is the gears that have been used historically are highly selective. The catch has been dominated by older, larger carp, which from a commercial fisheries perspective is great. Those are the fish you want to catch. There are a lot of biomass. If you're trying to make money catching poundage of fish, that's what you want to catch. But for carp in Utah Lake, we estimate this parameter called selectivity, which is really just the vulnerability of different age classes to being harvested. And you can see that the vulnerability of age 6 and 7 plus is really high. Those are all basically totally vulnerable to the gear. But starting age 3, 4, 5, much lower vulnerability. Age 0, 1, and 2, basically not caught at all. You can see that from the length frequency histogram of the length of fish caught in the harvest. Importantly, age 3, 4, and 5 fish are mature and they're spawning. So by not being fully vulnerable to the gears, this effort was leaving this pool of spawners out in the lake that allowed population to recover. So it's one of the gear limitations that we found from those early efforts. In other research, we found that if you could increase that selectivity, so improve our ability to capture those age 3, 4, and 5 individuals, it would really improve the effectiveness of the removal and reduce the Another challenge for carp control in Utah Lake is lake level changes. We all know Utah Lake's surface elevation changes quite a bit year to year, depending on interannual snowpack variations, how much water is coming into the lake, how much water is being held in reservoirs upstream. And these changes in lake level have really strong effects on carp recruitment, so how many offspring are produced by carp. Down the bottom right here, this is the estimated relationship between spawning biomass and recruitment of carp in the lake. We find that when the lake is high, recruitment is higher for the same number of spawners. When the lake is low, recruitment is lower for the same number of spawners. This is likely due to increased habitat availability for those juvenile carp to rear. We also find that high lake levels reduce the gear efficiency. So those seines are really effective when they can be pulled right onto a beach. They're less effective when the water is up in the vegetation and when the lake is above compromise and it's up into the terrestrial vegetation. Gear efficiency as well. And perhaps the biggest challenge is Utah Lake it's huge. It's one of the largest lakes in the world. By surface area, it's in the top 1% of lakes. The largest successful carp control in the world occurred in a lake that was 1/7 the size of Utah Lake. So this is a much bigger system that's ever been successful in before. And these productive populations, like common carp, really productive species, living in large ecosystems, are really resilient and resistant to disturbance. We can think of removal as a disturbance on their population. So if you knock them down, they're really good at coming right back. So it's not to say it can't be done, just saying it's going to take really big effort to knock them down. So moving forward, what control strategies provide the most effective path towards long-term carp reductions? So right now, we're exploring alternative carp control methods. As Maura just described in her presentation, JRIP and UWR have been testing out these baited box traps. They're active field testing this year, and they will be again next year as they're working out the kinks. We are going to be incorporating the data from those traps into our population model, so we can then assess their effectiveness and how you might need to scale them. We're also using our population model to simulate the effectiveness of these hypothetical alternatives. So there's Trojan Y chromosome, it's a genetic technology where you skew the sex ratio of the population towards all males to reduce their productivity. We're exploring targeted poison baits. So if you could distribute baits that target carp and only carp eat them, how much bait would you need and how much would that cost? We're examining scenarios where you inform your mechanical removals by lake level, since we see removal is much more effective at low lake levels. If you only removed them when the lake is low, how much more or less effective would that be? And then also, we can simulate increasing the scale. It's hard to get funding to increase the scale of removals, but in a simulation model, we can say, well, what if we had 10 times the budget, 100 times the budget, so on. We're looking into that. We're also continuing our population monitoring efforts to see how they're responding to control efforts, because again, just knowing how much is being removed does not tell us how the population is responding necessarily. And a couple quick some of the methods we're trying are not actually available yet. They're still hypothetical, like Trojan Y chromosomes for carp are still being developed. There's some folks at USU working on how you can actually produce Trojan Y carp, but we can assume that they are developed in these models, apply them in the system, and see how many you'd have to put out there each year in order to have an effect. And then we can assess the trade-offs between cost and control strategy effectiveness between these alternative combinations of different removal methods. So if you do mechanical removal plus Trojan Y chromosome, or Trojan Y chromosome and poison baits, which one gives you the best opportunity to remove carp while also being most effective cost-wise? importantly, a lot of the preliminary analyses we're doing suggest the need for increased investment for long-term impact. It's not to say that the efforts that have been ongoing won't periodically reduce carp biomass like they have in the past, but to maintain them at low abundances for long term is going to require more higher intensity investments in removals. So that, I'd like to thank the June Sucker Program for funding our research over the years, UDWR for all their help with data collection and just thoughtful feedback on our work, and everyone else who's helped with this project. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Tim. That was great. All right, so next we are going to have Andrew come up and present a little bit more about June sucker populations.
Everyone, my name's Andrew. I work for the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources, and I'm the June sucker and Utah lake biologist. So I'm just going to give kind of a brief update on what we've been seeing with the suckers in the lake for the past year. I'd like to start off by just thanking the June Sucker Recovery Implementation Program and all the partners involved with that for both funding and organizing this research. There's a lot of moving parts, so it's great to have awesome partners. So I'm going to start off talking a little bit about the 2024 spawning run. So historically, as has been mentioned over the course of the past 2 days, the population of spawning adults in Utah Lake and its tributaries was down to around 300. But since their listing and the formation of the recovery program, adults have rebounded quite a bit, and now there's a pretty substantial spawning run. So the way we monitor the spawning run is with pit tags. They're like little microchips that you would put in your cat or dog, and we have antennas spread out around the lake that we use to measure them. This picture on the right is a picture of our portable antennas, which we can deploy anywhere in the lake or the tributaries, and then we have a few fixed ones as well. So this map on the left is showing Utah Lake and the location of our fixed antennas. So we have one in the Provo River and one in Hobble Creek, which are the two primary spawning tributaries for the June sucker. And then in the past 2 years, we've been taking our portable antennas and putting them in the new Provo River Delta Restoration Project, just to try to get a better handle on how they're using these outflow channels and other areas of the delta before they go up and spawn in the riverine portion. So this graph is showing the daily number of unique detections that we saw on our fixed antenna in the Provo for both 2023 in red and 2024 in blue. One thing you'll notice is that numbers in 2024 were actually not quite as high as what we saw the first year of the Provo River Delta opening. With that being said, it's not any cause for alarm, and it's likely in part due to changes in lake level. Even though we had a lot of snowpack and flow in 2023, the lake was actually lower in 2023 than it was in 2024, at least at the onset of spawning. So even though it's lower this year, still very good in the grand scheme of the past few decades of the June sucker and how far they've come since there were, very few actually coming up into the tributaries. One good thing that we've seen in the Provo River Delta is that they're actually using the riverine portion of the delta on the upper end to spawn. We're seeing a large proportion of fish that are coming into the delta and being detected on those lower pit tag antennas, and we actually never see them move up to the fixed antenna, which indicates that they're using that habitat. And that was kind of a concern during the creation of the delta that you see towards the bottom of the map, there's the area of the Provo River, what we call the old channel where the river used to flow, that's now inaccessible to suckers, and they used to spawn in there. So it seems like there has been some good spawning habitat created inside the delta. An update from Hobble Creek. Again, blue is shown in 2024 and red in 2023. You'll notice that the spawn was a little bit earlier this year. A lot of fish came up earlier in May, and that's in large part due to flow and temperature. We had a really late winter in 2023, which delayed the spawn a little bit. For 2023 and 2024, both years have been consecutive record years for the spawning run in Hobble Creek. So that's a really promising sign that there's a lot of fish coming in there. But spawning adults isn't the only thing, although it's a really important component and actually a large part of the reason that they were downlisted from endangered to threatened, because there were enough adults present in Utah Lake that they were no longer at risk of imminent extinction. But a big component of them eventually being delisted is the production of juvenile suckers, which eventually grow into adults, kind of a self-sustaining population. So this is going to go over some of what we've seen with juveniles in the past 2 years. So to get from an adult June sucker to an adult June sucker, obviously the fish have to go through several stages. The eggs hatch, then larvae emerge, they drift, they grow up into juveniles, and then they have to survive a few years before they're able to reproduce. And at each one of these points, there's a lot of components that influence their survival. So just trying to keep track of how many are actually making it past that gauntlet is a pretty important component. This is a map showing some of our larval sampling in the Provo River Delta from this year. This is just two different methods, but basically the bigger the circles that you see, the more larvae that we saw. And I think the main takeaway here is that we actually saw larvae broadly dispersed throughout the entire delta. So it is working as intended. The fish are up in the river spawning, the eggs hatch, and the larvae are being carried by the flow into the delta and settling out into low flow, shallower habitats throughout the delta. With that being said, we've only actually seen 2 juvenile suckers in the delta this year during our surveys. We were seeing more earlier in the year, but they were still too small to actually effectively capture with our gears, which we use electrofishing and seining. And the 2 suckers that we did find were in the just limited to the riverine portion, or the lower end of it, where it starts to fan out, despite the fact that we were seeing larvae spread broadly throughout the delta. I wouldn't say this is cause for alarm. It can take quite a while for a restoration area to kind of settle and start seeing the effects of that. And we've actually seen that a lot with Hobble Creek. And that's an area where we have historically focused most of our sampling for June suckers in the past. But there's another restoration area further upstream on Hobble Creek called the East Hobble Creek Restoration Area. And excitingly, we did some sampling there this spring, and we discovered that there were actually juvenile suckers inhabiting that upstream reach. Not only that, but it was the spring of this year, 2024, so they were suckers that had been overwintered since the previous spawn. So that's a really promising sign that suckers are actually surviving that first winter. In the fall of 2024, unfortunately, we found fewer juveniles than the fall of 2023, so fewer of this year's spawn, although they were present at both the Hobble WMA and that East Hobble Creek Restoration Area. They also appeared to be more limited in kind of habitat usage than they were last year. Last year, we were finding juvenile suckers spread throughout the main channel down at the WMA, and this year they were pretty much exclusively found in really shallow, like less than half a foot marginal habitats. And one of the big differences we saw this year compared to last year was actually the non-native fish community in the WMA. There were large schools of white bass this year that weren't present last year, and it has us wondering whether or not, large influxes of non-native fish in these systems is influencing not only sucker abundance, but also where they're actually living within these areas. So we started collecting some additional data during our juvenile samples, where basically we're collecting data at a finer spatial scale than we would have historically. Normally we would have done a reach of river, so a few hundred yards, and aggregated all the data together, but now we're collecting that at a really smaller scale, so individual pools or eddies, and we're collecting both fish data there and habitat data, things like depth, flow, substrate. This is an example of what some of that sampling looks like. This was from Hobble Creek in the WMA this year, so at each one of these red points, we're collecting data on all the fish, including which species they are, the abundances of them, lengths, as well as all that habitat data. With all that being said, there's a lot of hope to be had for the June sucker right now. We've found more juveniles the past 2 years than the program has seen since its inception. So we're looking forward to seeing what both Hobble Creek and the Provo River Delta have to offer the June sucker, and are hopeful for some successful years in the future. So yeah, with that, we can go to questions.
Okay, great. Well, thanks everyone for presenting. So now we are going to take questions about any of these 3 presentations that you just saw. Just raise your hand and a microphone will be brought to you, similar to yesterday. So if you guys have any questions, please feel free to ask these lovely presenters.
I've heard the term bullhead before. I don't really understand what a bullhead is. Could you explain that?
So a bullhead is a particular species of catfish in the lake. There's actually 2 species of catfish. There's channel catfish, which are the ones that you typically see people fish for. They get much larger, upwards of 2 feet. Bullheads are a smaller species that only get to about 1 foot long, maybe a little bit bigger.
Okay, thank you. And then on the capturing of carp with this new system with nets, I understand it's a pilot. Is that scalable? To what point do you feel like you could scale that to maximum effectiveness if it continues to work? In other words, is it going to go around the perimeter of the lake where you would do that, or how does that scale upward if it continues to succeed?
I think at the moment we're not totally sure. We ran a quite small team this year just to test out the gear. Next year we're going to scale things up a little bit and sort of evaluate that. I imagine it'll be pretty targeted at certain areas, at least for a while, but we're still not sure it's the way going forward. So a bit of a non-answer for you, I'm afraid. Sorry.
Has anybody done a comparison of the reduction of carp and the increase of the good species, so to speak?
Yeah, so I think actually Kevin Landom will be talking a little bit about that coming up, but we've been doing monitoring in the lake, so just how the ecosystems responded. And don't want to steal too much of Kevin's thunder, but we do, when the carp were at their lowest biomass, we did see increased condition of June sucker, as well as increased condition of white bass. And we saw more of the kind of preferred prey for June sucker in the lake when there were fewer carp. But Kevin will talk a bit more about that, I think, in a minute.
I just wanted to clarify on Tim, your slide. So, of course, there's many factors that play into carp, and I just wanted to clarify. So we had 3 years of declining carp population, is what I remember, but with the pandemic, it just shot back up. So it kind of canceled out 3 years of work. Is that what I'm understanding?
So it basically declined from 2009 through 2017, and then stayed low for another couple years, and then shot back up after that. It was primarily due to carp demonstrate this this pattern called overcompensation, where when you reduce their spawning biomass, you can actually increase the amount of recruitment because there's less competition among their offspring. Had some high lake level years that were really good for their recruitment, and there was some kind of economic challenges with the removal program for a couple years there as well. So a whole combination of things. Yeah.
I was just wondering if the poison bait approach has been attempted, and what are some of the ramifications with that approach?
Yeah, so it has not been attempted. It's kind of a hypothetical. The poison bait would still need to be developed. You'd obviously need to develop one that June sucker are not attracted to. So we were running those models based on best case scenario. This bait can be developed. Nothing else eats it. the carp eat only enough that they suffer, lethal interaction with it and no more, just to see, in the best case, would it be feasible? That was the whole point of that. But to my knowledge, it hasn't been tested anywhere on carp, and I don't believe that the specific bait has actually been successfully developed yet. But the idea has been out there for a little while. Yeah.
Thank you.
For the juvenile carp, do you know what their, how they grow and if you can interrupt their growth cycle as their young carp? Is there a way to do that?
I'm not aware of any ways to interrupt their growth cycle. They are omnivores. They'll eat pretty much anything, any plant matter, organic matter, insects, zooplankton in the lake. I'm not aware of any growth disruptors out there, but maybe some folks who are a little more familiar with hatchery production systems might have more information on that. But I'm not aware of any. They grow really fast as part of the challenge.
This is for Keith. So question about with the white bass potentially being in with the habitat with the juveniles and whatnot. You kept saying not cause for concern, which is appreciated. So I'm kind of wondering what do you look for when there is a time to have concern? What are the flags that have to happen to be worried that juveniles and spawning habitat is being overpredated or something like that?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's definitely something that we're currently working on within the recovery program. Especially in the Provo River Delta, the system's still really new, so we don't have a great understanding of how it's working. So yeah, it's kind of a non-answer for you, but we're working on developing, that kind of thing right now, because it certainly is a major concern for us.
Yeah, this is more of a comment and expanding on a lot of what was said, but I just wanted to circle back to the juvenile carp question too, and point out that the box traps that Maura talked about, we are actually catching not necessarily juvenile fish, but those smaller carp that are still at reproductive age, and so that's another advantage of those box traps, that starts shifting that gear selectivity to the smaller carp.
So with the box trap bait ones compared to the former sign removal for carp, perhaps you mentioned this and I just missed it, but have you been able to ascertain the relative effectiveness, and could it be scaled up to in terms of poundage of fish removed? How do they compare so far? I know it's just the first year, but.
We're kind of holding off on making big comparisons like that this season and going to wait for the 2-year data. We are working on some estimates of that, but at the moment, we're not making any sweeping statements just because so many things were experimental this year that we don't really have a way to say with any certainty and wouldn't want to give you guys false information.
This is a question for Tim. Do we know where the carp are spawning, or is it so widespread that it's just not hopeful to be able to exclude them from those areas?
It's pretty widespread. You'll see them spawning around the lake, just in shallow areas around the beaches from basically May through August. They also run up some of the rivers and spawn. In the lakes where they've been really successful at reducing them, they've been able to kind of isolate these habitats and basically block access to them. That'd be a real challenge in a lake the size of Utah Lake, where they have such widespread opportunity. That's something that's been considered, but be quite a task to do that. Yeah.
Another question I was wondering about is with the June sucker being downgraded from endangered to threatened, how does that happen? Does it require a year-over-year numbers thing, or is it just a 1 year off numbers thing in order to make that move?
It is based off multiple years of data. upon reaching that conclusion. There's a process that U.S. Fish and Wildlife goes over where they solicit feedback from biologists and other folks to kind of determine whether or not they hit those criteria. But it's not just their population at one particular point in time.
Andrew did a great job of explaining that, but just to add on, it's also not just the population level that the Fish and Wildlife Service looks at. It's also the threats and how the threats and the stressors are being addressed when they are considering the status of a species.
All right, well, thank you, everybody. Those were great questions. I'm happy we got so many. So now we are going to take about a 10 to 15-minute break and come together back at 10 and learn a little bit more about ecosystems and vegetation.
Future potential ecosystem changes. And that is kind of the overarching goal of this project regarding Junesucker and its endemic Utah Lake ecosystem. Collecting from the same sites as shown in this sample map here during the same times a year, every year, so that data is comparable across years. Including water quality with contributions from the Division of Water Quality. Phytoplankton are provided by the Division of Water Quality. Zooplankton, macrophytes, macroinvertebrates, and fish in collaboration with the Division of Wildlife. Now, this project began in 2012. However, some of these data span older than 2012. Some began 2012 or 13 or 14. But at this point, all these data sets qualify as long-term ecological data. Now, one of the objectives of this project has been to test for an ecosystem response to carp removal. And we've observed a number of beneficial ecosystem responses. As one example, carp and Junesucker rely on very similar prey items in the form of zooplankton and macroinvertebrates. And what we have found is when carp biomass is low, carp population biomass, we see a competitive release for the shared prey resources, which, as Tim mentioned, results in an increase in body condition of Junesucker. So the fish get fatter, which can be a good thing in the fish world. But Junesucker are not alone in this ecosystem. We see a similar response of an increase in the body condition of some of the sport fish, such as white bass and channel catfish, when the carp population biomass is low. However, some of these responses have been limited. For example, we've seen an increase in the presence of rooted aquatic vegetation, or our submerged vegetation, that is correlated with low carp population biomass. And this is an important habitat as predator refuge for young Junesucker. As they leave the tributaries, they need some sort of predator refuge. But this response has been limited. Lake-wide, the distribution and abundance and density of this habitat has been pretty low. So that was a very brief summary of 13 years of research and a 60-page report. But I want to focus more on what we plan to do moving forward. Utah Lake field sampling is a major part of this project. I should have added lab processing of samples to this as well. But the goal here is to provide a baseline for comparison against future changes. So we want to just continue to build these data sets as they've been collected in the past. So it's going to be business as usual. However, we did add a new ecosystem to this project, the Provo River Delta, beginning with water temperature monitoring. Purchased 30 of these, they're called hobo temperature lockers that collect data continuously. We spread them throughout the delta to characterize the spatial and temporal variability and water temperature. We began this in 2013, and this year we have a much longer temporal component now that we have all the gear. We set them out in March, and we'll be pulling them next month, and we plan to continue this moving forward into 2025. Additionally, we established 3 sites, one upstream, one midstream, and one downstream in the delta for water quality, zooplankton, and macroinvertebrate monitoring. This is monthly sampling, May through October, which is the same approach we take for zooplankton and macroinvertebrates in the lake. And we plan to continue this moving forward to hopefully establish a long-term data set as a baseline. Moving away from field sampling and more towards the research questions, we plan to continue to test for a response to carp removal. However, as things are changing, we are fully prepared to address new questions or questions towards new goals as things change. And additionally, one of my personal research interests is to further explore this trophic overlap that we see among June sucker and some of the other fish species, particularly carp, and what implications that may have for future June sucker recovery. And in regard to research questions regarding the delta, we plan to expand on some previous work, bioenergetics work done in our lab by Christina Travasa. On this plot here, she has sampling date on the X, August through November, and this is 2023, the first year of this data collection. On the Y on the left, she has our hobo temp logger sites that are sorted. On the bottom of the Y are those that are closest to the lake. On the top are those farthest upstream from the lake. And what she's showing here is habitat suitability based on growth potential for young a year June sucker. So the red colors represent very high growth potential. The blue colors, very low growth potential. And what we have found is that there's substantial spatial variability during the warmer summer months in the delta, and that there are hotspots of growth opportunity. And work done on other species have shown that it's possible these younger year will actually track optimal temperatures throughout the delta. But this is theoretical. What we would hope to do in the future is to pair this with actual fish catch data from the delta. And that moves us to our new grad student, Austin Garner. His focus will be on the Provo River Delta. The first part of his thesis will be digging into some of the pit tag data that Andrew just talked about to further explore the adult spawning migratory behaviors and whether there's some sort of patterns in that behavior, such as males versus females, or the fish that we can age, do they behave differently at different ages? And he will also be exploring fish community dispersal patterns in the delta and whether those are correlated with environmental variables, such as the water temperature data we've been collecting. He's also collecting fish diets to better understand some of the trophic relationships, but it's unclear whether this will be a main focus of his thesis or possibly an undergrad research project that you could possibly have presented here next year. And the zooplankton and macroinvertebrates that we started collecting this year, we plan to explore some of the prey availability characteristics for things like young and of year June sucker, and how that may differ between the delta and the lake, and just how the communities may differ between the delta and the lake. And so that's all I have. I'd like to acknowledge the June sucker recovery implementation program. Scott Daly with Division of Water Quality, Keith and Andrew with the Division of Wildlife, Russ Franklin with the Water Conservancy District, and of course Addy from Utah Lake Authority, who's helped us with some of this field work. And we cannot accomplish all this work without a small army of interns. They did a great job this year, kept a good attitude in one of the hottest summers that I've ever experienced on Utah Lake, and they deserve a lot of credit. And that's all I have. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Kevin. All right, so we are going to have a very small change to our agenda. So up next was Blake Wellard, but he is hopefully coming up here right at this very moment. So got stuck in a wreck on I-15. Shocking. So I am actually going to go next, and I am talking on behalf of myself and Keith Hambrecht with Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. Hopefully this will load. All right. Great. So, again, my name is Addy Valdez, and I work for Utah Lake Authority. I'm a conservation biologist. And then Keith Ehrenbrecht, who I work very closely with Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, is the invasive species coordinator for state and sovereign lands. So we work really closely together, and that's why we figured this presentation would be good to kind of merge together as one. He is currently bedridden with surgery kind of afterwardsness. So he really wanted to be here today, but he was gracious enough to help me coordinate with this presentation. So really excited to tell you guys a little bit more about it. So we work really closely with Utah Lake and its vegetation. So we're going to talk a little bit about what Utah Lake's vegetation was then, now, and what we're looking forward to seeing in the future. So some of you were here yesterday to catch my presentation, and we're just going to go a little bit more into depth about it today, and kind of talk a little bit about its relationship to Great Salt Lake and how we kind of can move forward together with them in the future. So in the past, you all have probably heard of Phragmites by now. That's Phragmites australis. It is an invasive weed that is all over the West and particularly in Utah. So that is one of our biggest challenges we face. Another invasive species we deal with is tamarisk and then also Russian olive. Those are invasive tree species, and they are all over Utah Lake. So they are not just a Utah Lake problem, but we particularly have a lot of them. So in 2012, there was over 12,000 or 10,000 acres of Phragmites on Utah Lake. So you can see just here in this picture, it really takes over. There's not a lot of room for any other vegetation to grow, even trees. It just grows very thick, very tall, can get over 15 feet tall, and it grows rhizotomously. So that just means it grows underneath the ground through a root system, and it also spreads very well by seed. So it makes it very good at its job at being invasive. So that means it also makes it really hard to get rid of. So one of the biggest tasks that was taken on in around the 2010 time was a huge collaborative effort to treat it. And that took a ton of partners and a ton of funding to get started. That started with Forestry, Fire, State Lands, Utah County. At the time is Utah Lake Commission, Utah State University, and then the programs through the state of Watershed Restoration Initiative, and then the Invasive Species Mitigation Program. And those partners and those funding opportunities made it all possible. So again, it was a really daunting effort to take on. 10,000 acres is not light, and Utah Lake is very large. So it was definitely a daunting task to take on for all of these partners at the time. So this is just an example again of what they were dealing with at the time. So it was just seas and seas of ongoing Phragmites that not only caused human disturbances with safety issues, people getting lost while they're trying to go waterfowl hunting. It also causes issues with wildlife by creating a large monoculture. And then it also can decrease water quality and just provide an overall hazard on Utah Lake. So getting rid of it was a challenge, but we made a lot of progress. So how we dealt with it definitely started with just treatment. And again, this took over a decade of work to work through and be able to determine what was our best management practice that we were working with. So these all started with research-backed best practices through the USU Extension Office and some of the researchers up there in Karin Kettering, who is one of the most specialized Phragmites researchers here in Utah. And through USU, we were really able to get what are our best management practices with pesticide treatment. And again, pesticides are tricky to use, but they are a tool in our tool bag. So they are really effective when used safely, when used properly over time. And again, while being safe while using them, they can be very, very effective at treating Phragmites. So there are some trade-offs that come with it. You know, we were getting really effective large acreage treatment with our helicopter spraying as well as our Marshmaster spraying. But we did occasionally see die-offs in some areas that maybe weren't supposed to be treated. So we are still working with the trade-offs that come with pesticide usage. But again, it is just one of those extra tools that we have in our bag in order to treat invasive species. We also faced a lot of equipment challenges. So originally, Marshmasters were not here. We had never heard of those. Those didn't exist. And if you guys haven't ever heard of a Marshmaster or been on one, they're basically large aquatic tanks that float. It's pretty impressive. So beforehand, finding the right equipment to get out in the marsh, get out in this area that's really soupy, not particularly easy to move through, was one of the biggest challenges. But once marsh masters were kind of discovered and brought to Utah County, they have been our savior. And a really big shout out to Utah County Weed Control and all the people that work in that department. They have made all of it possible in the last decade. We love to take credit for things, but they are really the people out on the ground making things happen, doing all the dirty work and making it possible to see this change. So huge shout out to those guys. And a really important thing with doing all this treatment over a decade is monitoring it. So this began through me, Duncan. She's actually here in the Department of Ag and Food. She started doing some monitoring for how effective is our treatment, whether that's spraying or mowing or anything else like that. And so she really established what it was to monitor here on Utah Lake for our vegetation change. So that really established what are we looking at and how is it changing. And again, consistency is really key for getting this management to work for invasive weeds, especially Phragmites. It's, again, very good at its job. It takes over 3 years of consecutive treatment in an area for it to be mostly gone. So then we're kind of at this stage now that we've treated Phragmites, again, a decade. It's a long time. So what about after it's gone? What do we do now that we're in this new stage? So now it's really more of an exciting time. This is something that is, like everything else we're going through on Utah Lake, a little open-ended. We don't really know what we're getting ourselves into, but we're excited to experiment. We're excited to try and to make Utah Lake a more enjoyable place for not only all the things that live on it, but the people that experience it too. So what we've learned from over this decade of treatment is that restoration takes time. Again, I keep saying a decade, and it truly has been of 10 to 12 years of this really consistent work from all of our partners. And we've been able to accomplish over a 75% reduction in Phragmites cover on Utah Lake. That's a little bit messed up, but please ignore that. So it is on Utah Lake, and this picture here really shows what it looks like when there isn't Phragmites on the landscape anymore. It's open, it's walkable, it's clear, there's a mix of vegetation, and that's really what we're shooting for. So being able to see this reduction has been amazing. And again, people who have lived here on the lake are able to go out and see that this change is being made over the last 10 years, that it's really made a big difference. And that's something that we love to see, and we love to hear that people are experiencing that change. And not only have we been doing Phragmites treatment, we've also kind of been starting some restorative actions. So that's sort of seeding. That's our most cost-effective option. Seeding, we found out, is complicated. A lot of the wetland species that we are trying to get out on Utah Lake don't necessarily like to seed very easily. So that has been another kind of research component that we're really excited to explore and determine how can we be most cost effective when restoring vegetation on this system now that Phragmites is gone. So we found out that revegetation can be both passive and active. So with that, just means passive means, hey, we got rid of all this Phragmites, there's open ground. Some things that have been historically in the seed bank just come back by themselves, and that's great. That basically means the land is doing our job for us. But there's also a large active component as well. So that's when managers like myself and others have to step in to really try to change the course of the revegetation direction so that Phragmites does not have the opportunity to come back in. And with all of this that we do, adaptation is key, and acting quickly is really important. Again, Phragmites is a very evil species. It's really fast, and it loves to get back into the areas that it used to live in. So working with that is really important, to be quick and adaptable. And again, our collaboration is so vital to make this happen. I'm not doing this by myself. There's so many partners that are involved, so many researchers. It takes a lot of effort. So what we're doing to do more of our restorative vegetation, you can see here, there's kind of, again, passive and active. And this requires research, application, and then current management. So with our seeding, our most cost-effective option, USU is just now starting a seed bank study that they got funding for from the EPA, which is amazing. I think it's 3 to 4 years of funding, and they are doing that here on Utah Lake to determine what is our seeding or our seed bank looking like, how well can we utilize it, and like how long is it going to last, essentially. And another thing we're doing is pollinator emphasis. So pollinators are those little species that are moving around and basically moving pollen across plants so that we can have more plants, we can have more food, we can have us, we can live. So that's also a really important factor when we're considering all of our revegetation efforts. And when it comes to vegetation, I've talked about seed, but another thing we started doing is more annual hand on the ground revegetation. So that's planting plugs, which are basically just baby little plants, and then also doing sod mats. So you can see in the top picture here, this is one of our events we ran this year. They're called planting parties. So we ran 11 of them this year, had 450 volunteers, and got over 10,000 plants in the ground with those guys. And it's really important to be getting these people involved in our revegetation, not only just us as managers, because we want people to care about Utah Lake. You saw that a lot yesterday if you were here. Getting people to care and create a sense of place for this lake is really important. And this is a way that we found that people really get involved with Utah Lake's landscape and really actually enjoy doing it. And it's actually effective for us as well. So education is a big part of these events. So we're kind of getting a couple rewards out of these events, which is really nice to see. So this is an example of an area that was Phragmites free. This is on the north shore of Utah Lake, in North Lake Park specifically. It's a beautiful area if you get out there. All of these plants that you basically see in front of you were planted by us and by a contractor. So this is a mix of grasses, sedges, pollinator species, and you can see it doesn't really look like much, but we're really looking forward to next spring seeing what this is going to look like. And again, just as a reminder, we've had a 75% reduction in Phragmites cover on Utah Lake, which is giant. That's almost 8,000 acres, which that doesn't really do it justice for how much it really is. We've spread almost 7,000 pounds of seed across the shoreline of Utah Lake, and then we've had 25,000 native plants installed manually, and that's either by volunteers or by contractor. And then we've also had sod mats installed as well. I'm not going to steal Blake's thunder, but he's doing that next. And then we've had over 450 volunteers involved over the course of the summer. So we are really looking to amp this up next year and be able to kind of get it to the next level. So what's next, I won't hold you here for too much longer. We're really looking forward to having all these new funding sources to be able to upgrade our revegetation and our restoration efforts. So this doesn't just involve revegetation. It's also conservation of some of the areas that we already have that are intact, that look great, that we're trying to keep as a model for what we can continue to build. And again, we want to keep getting people involved. The more people care about this, the more people have a firsthand experience, the more money they're going to want to invest in the better place that we can make Utah Lake. So a lot of different funding coming in on the right, and we're really looking forward to utilizing that to our best ability. We are forming a vegetation work group for Utah Lake here in the next month that will really be helping make these decisions. So that's involved with university professors, researchers, managers, all the people who have stakes and are involved in Utah Lake's vegetation management. So these are just some pictures of what we have to look forward to. So on the far left is actually a Utes ladies tress that we found on Utah Lake. Really exciting to see their rare endangered plant species. In the middle, we have a paintbrush species they're so beautiful to look at. And then on the right is called a skull's cap. But again, these are all charismatic species that are great to look at. So we love to get these colorful, bright plants on the ground because people like to look at them. And this is Keith out on this parcel this is an example of an area we want to conserve because it's so diverse, has a great mix of pollinators, grasses, sedges, everything that we want on Utah Lake. We want to build it everywhere else that we have gotten rid of Phragmites, and now there's this open land to use. So we are really looking to restore this type of habitat. Again, this is another example of what dynamic habitat can look like. You know, it's not just all one plant, it's not just Phragmites. It's open, there's pockets of other species. This is what our model is of what we are trying to build. So I really appreciate your guys' time. This is me, Sam, and Heather after a very long day of unloading all these plants. They're all behind us. We were very hot and sweaty and tired. So a lot of work goes into this, and I just want to thank everyone that works with us, all of our partners, the Utah Pollinator Habitat Program, all of our universities we work with, the Forestry, Fire, and State Lands Department, and then Utah County for doing all our on-the-ground work. So thank you very much. And I'm going to actually pass it right to Blake Wellard. I'll get his presentation pulled up, and then we'll do questions after that.
Hi, my name is Blake Wellard. I've been involved with a lot of aspects of wetland restoration and wetland inventory and surveys for about the last 14 years. Really help expand on what Addy just discussed, and it's really getting into some of these wetland reference ecosystems as a restoration target. So I'll just dive right in. So with all this herbicide treatment that we've done and all of the development activity around Utah Lake, we're down to the very last few remaining reference wetland systems within the valley. And first and foremost, these wetland systems can be extremely informative. They really help set our restoration target. As Addy mentioned, they are full pollinator species, and these ecosystems really can be our guide for what our restoration around the lake should look like. And we need to protect as many of these remaining systems that we have while we still can. And then once we're able to protect these systems, identify where these systems are located, we need to be able to capture that biodiversity. Wetlands are much more than emergent aquatic vegetation. There's so much more going on to our systems. If we're going to permanently change these landscapes back to Phragmites free, there's a handful of species that we need to be able to source from these systems in order to do that. So these reference ecosystems, we need to be able to preserve that biodiversity so we can capture and put it to use. And then third, we need to actually have some domestic production. It's very difficult to source most of the species that I'm talking about. And I won't be getting into a ton of detail on these individual species. I'd be happy to talk with any of you about that on the side. But we're talking about about 120 different native wetland plant species in these systems. And I want to discuss how I think we can improve our production. So how do we know we're looking at a reference wetlands? Well, fortunately, we have really good notes. I'm never going to know what the Spanish explorers saw, but based on what I can determine from some translations, they were seeing very much the same things that Walter Cottam was seeing in 1926. Walter Cottam's work is the first comprehensive scientific study of the plant communities around Utah Lake. And I'm very happy to say, but also somewhat reluctant, that about 100 years later, I can still see everything he saw, minus about 2 or 3 species. But I have to go to so many properties to do so. We're down to all these wetland fragments. But with the notes and the details that Walter Cottam included in his dissertation, I'm able to kind of deconstruct what he saw and match it up to what I'm seeing on the landscape. And we still have a handful of these very intact systems that can be our guide. Because I'm convinced that it's going to be a community approach, not an individual species approach, that will permanently help us reach our restoration goals and prevent the reinvasion of Phragmites or secondary invasion from other undesirable vegetation. So I've already kind of hit on this, but here's an example of a wetlands that American Fork actually preserved. I was very happy to hear this story. I want to say it's a 3rd grade class gave a very heartfelt presentation to the mayor and council of American Fork City to talk about this wetlands that is home to monarchs every single year. It has abundant swamp milkweed, it has abundant pollinator species, and this is a monarch hotspot, a biodiversity hotspot. And they made a case, and American Fork City protected this wetland, renamed it Monarch Park. I feel like these are some things that we can do with some of these last remaining wetlands that we have left. I want people to be able to interact with these spaces, and I was very happy to see a community-led effort to preserve one of these fen systems. But these are extremely complex, and if I didn't have something to study in context, I don't know how I'd be able to help figure out how these species fit together in a complex community. So it's very important that we preserve these, study these, get quantitative data out of these, and capture that biodiversity so we can recreate these spaces on these wetlands that we're treating or removing the Phragmites. So these systems can support at least 5 canopy layers, extremely complex, and sometimes they could be taller than me. Arrived at what I think is our way forward for producing and saving these systems. And we've been looking at rebuilding aquatic food webs. There's a lot of interest in managing and mitigating harmful algal blooms. And we're seeking to do a top-down approach that really seeks to rebuild the ecology within the lake itself. And my job with that was producing hardstem bulrush, But part of that journey, we quickly realized that we did not have the plant production capacity needed to carry out the projects and experiments we were seeking to do. So then in 2023, I created a large nursery at Tempanoke Special Service District, and we're using their treated effluent water to as the water source, the irrigation source of these plants. And while I mostly produced hard stem bulrush, as you can see on the right, I also did very small growing experiments with some of the biodiversity from these wetland reference systems that I was talking about. And I've discovered that this process is capable of producing abundant wetland plants very quickly. And we were able to produce thousands of hard stem bulrush. We mostly use that to make bare root hard stem bulrush mats and small mat segments that were planted directly into the lake. Our goal was to plant a vegetative wave wall that was roughly 3 meters wide by 500 meters long. We ran into some complications by planting some of these hard stem bulrush mats in the lake, so we modified our design. But we were able to put out I want to say it was roughly about a third of an acre of hard stem bulrush out into the lake. I'm just comparing that to the size of the nursery. And these hard stem bulrush will be used next year in some of the nutrient cycling studies if we can continue our funding and our experimentation. But having this type of aquatic vegetation is critical to building the macroinvertebrate community and the zooplankton community. And it's through providing habitat for those species, as well as the mollusks, that we can start addressing some of the challenges with the nutrient cycling and the availability of nutrients that create harmful algal blooms that we're dealing with and we'd like to mitigate. But I'd really like to also just present this as a concept because I think this is a role that all wastewater treatment plants can play in Utah. The availability of the treated effluent, it is extremely good at growing wetland plants and very quickly. There's just enough nutrients that the wetland plants can grow very fast, and we can have an abundance of wetland plant material for all of our wetland revegetation needs. And we can start to make some of these community component species that are presently unsourceable, particularly from local sources, more widely available. And I'm really hoping that we can start making some more material available. So here's an example of what we're working on. We were transporting these sod mat segments out to the lake, and we had them staggered in a checkerboard formation. We've determined that planting in an emergent aquatic setting is particularly challenging. Utah Lake tends to get storms almost every afternoon. Whether or not there's precipitation or not, the waves start coming up in the afternoon, and that is particularly difficult environment to restore emergent aquatic vegetation. So to plant these mat segments in these bare root segments, we had to harness them in place. So we had 4-foot stakes that were connected by a rope that was 5 feet long, and we essentially created harnesses that we would kind of web over these bulrush mat segments and hammer them down into the lake in order to secure this vegetation. And now that the lake level is starting to drop, they're even getting more soil contact and they're starting to root in, and I'm feeling more confident that our efforts will not be wasted. I feel like this is a really good model going forward. But this project, I have so much thanks to Addy and Utah Lake Authority for providing a really good volunteer base. And I'm very appreciative of the Utah Conservation Corps who helped secure some teams at the last minute to help us finish off these plantings. But before I had that assistance, this was just carried out by me, a project partner, and a handful of students. I really see universities partnering with water treatment plants as one of our ways forward. I think professors and students could help come up with internship programs with wastewater treatment plants, and we don't even have to cover very much space. We're talking about running a nursery maybe the size of this room or smaller, and in a space like that, we're talking about being able to produce thousands of plants. And these plants can be available for whatever use, whatever experimentation, or just even coming up with means in which some of this plant material can help create public-private partnerships and be able to provide seed and plant materials to private growers. A really big role to step up and play to help make some of these less common species that will be critical in our fight to restoring Utah Lake more widely available. So I'm really hoping to just get this on people's radar, and really help people understand how accessible this is. In terms of the infrastructure, it probably costs less. I reran the numbers. It was less than $10,000 to set up our growing infrastructure. And then we just simply tapped into the existing effluent that was already flowing to the lake. We made it do a brief pit stop into the nursery, and then it returned on its way out in its drainage culvert back to the lake. So we're just the nursery is definitely providing further water filtration on its little pit stop through the wetland nursery. And I think these systems can be really well managed and minimally staffed and have maximum results. And I would love to visit with any of you about this and just put it on everyone's radar as a good way forward for revegetative needs within Utah Lake. And I'd really like to thank, again, Utah Lake Authority and Timpanogos Special Service District. And we have Jeff Danbleeker here, who is the project manager over this, and Brett here, who's been helping with all the aquatic insects of the project. And I've been very happy to work with all of these people, and David Richards, who's really helped come up with some of the big ideas for some of the work we're doing, and Rich Mickelson for having the confidence to give this a try, because I really am excited about the restoration methodology and just for the future direction. I do, with my job with Salt Lake City, I have received a soft promise of 2 acres to set up wetland plant nurseries with Salt Lake City's wastewater treatment plants. And I'm very excited to be able to start forming community partnerships, because that 2 acres of wetland plant production will exceed my internal capacity. And I'm hoping to see community partnerships to make that wetland plant material more widely available for everyone. Because we really have a special system here, and I want us all to have a chance to, those that it's applicable, have a chance to study the wetland plant ecosystem, reference ecosystems. These are critical spaces that are deserving of conservation, but we need improved infrastructure to make those plants more available for projects. And thank you. That's all I have.
All right. Well, thanks everybody. So now we have about 10 minutes for any questions for Kevin, Blake, or myself. I'll go sit with them. So any questions, we'd love to have them. So please begin.
As for Blake, did you perchance measure any water quality parameters into and out of your gardens?
I do believe that Jeff would be better to answer that, but I do believe that we did one sampling. But at least anecdotal observations suggest that quite a bit was being taken out, because these hard stem bulrush were maybe 20% bigger than the wild type. But I don't have those numbers with me right now.
I also have a question for Blake. I think this is this is a pretty cool idea, and I know there is just a lack of wetland plant nurseries and sources, so this is great. But I'm wondering what kind of like invertebrate sampling you did in the nurseries, and specifically thinking about, I guess, moving native invertebrates, but also taking precautions against inadvertent movement of non-native species around.
Yeah. So we didn't sample anything in the nurseries, and all the material that we sourced came from Utah Lake itself. So even if we were moving any non-native microinvertebrates, they came from the lake itself. So we felt like that was our safest option. We did start the nursery with rhizome divisions, and those rhizomes came from just a short distance away, like a system that was directly connected to the lake, a small little lagoon off the side of Timpanogos Special Service District. But we did have there were some snails, and the snails were all identified as being common pond snails.
I just wondered, did you study other species besides the hard stem bulrush to use?
Yeah, we did. So I grew giant burreed. I grew sluice sedge. I grew Stachy's pilosa, which is hedge nettle. I grew some marsh buttercup and Perficaria amphibia, which is water smartweed. But I tried a few other wetland forbs as well, and the system produced very large plant materials and the plant materials grew um, fast. They were very healthy. What I would do to change the production style is simply just manipulate the water depth to match the species requirements, because we grew in water that was 7 inches to accommodate hardstem bulrush's emergent aquatic needs. But even with hardstem bulrush, I think I would have had better planting success had I dropped the water depth, because I increased my production of a highly buoyant cell type called Arenchyma cells with that water depth, and that buoyancy made planting more difficult. Had I dropped the water depth to, say, 2 inches, I think I would have had less of that buoyant cell type, and planting would be easier. But with the other species, particularly sluicid, which I think is one of our best bets in fighting Phragmites, that plant particularly liked the conditions and grew abundantly and produced many vegetative offsets, and some of which even spread into adjacent sod mats in the nursery, and those got planted out into the lake.
All right. Excuse me. I have a question. Where you planted on the edge of the lake, the goal, I'm assuming, is so it'll grow, fill up, and come in on the land.
Yeah.
But once it gets to the land, what's going to keep it alive if it doesn't have rain coming, which is usual?
Right. So that's a challenge. So that's why we chose the depth that we did for planting, because managing bulrush mats that were this developed and this large made it difficult to plant at depth. But we chose to plant at one of the low water points of 2022. So hopefully we have these at strategic position that when the lake does go back down for long periods of time, the bulrush rhizomes will be able to adapt and keep themselves in the preferred hydrological zone. So, and then we also had to plant them in such dense volume because they have strength in numbers. There's a lot of literature to suggest that there's a critical mass for hardstem bulrush, and once it hits that mass, it's able to be much more resilient to environmental factors like waves or ice. And we have to contend with both of those at Utah Lake.
If you have an area where you have cleared Phragmites and good vegetation has been established, then the Phragmites reappear there. Can you selectively treat that, or what do you do to kind of not kill the good stuff, but get rid of those?
So this is what Addy was getting into. We're kind of entering a new phase. So a lot of the large acreage has been taken care of, but we're now entering the period where we need more precise surgical strikes. So I think ground crews for now, but I'm very excited about the use of drones and AI. We do have herbicide spraying drones, and we want to start experimenting with the use of herbicide drones more to be able to spot treat Phragmites. But right now we're talking about ground crews that might be doing mechanical cutting and then spot treating later, and the continued use of revegetation as we treat. Because ideally, if we have these wetland plant materials available, we can couple our treatment with restoration within the same time frame. So we can help shape what comes in after. Because what a situation Addy talked about is becoming increasingly rare. We've been at this now for a decade, and what that means is we've had a lot of collateral damage in that time. So we can't just simply spray and expect good things to come back anymore. Those days are largely over. So now when we spray, we usually get secondary invasion from other undesirable species. So the combination of the spot spraying and revegetation should help prevent and break that cycle, I think. Yeah.
Obviously, Phragmites is not the only invasive species problem we have. Do you have any guidance on where we go for guidance on controlling other invasive species? I'm talking about Russian olive, thistle, cocklebur, white top. I mean, it's like it's a lab for invasive species
Right.
on there.
So Utah State and Forestry, Fire, and State Lands has written some best management practices for tamarisk, Russian olive, and Phragmites. I don't know if they've written it for other species. Cocklebur is one of those unfortunate prolific native weeds that can get out of hand in disturbed conditions. Yeah, but some of those other species are challenging, and I think the comprehensive revegetation is key. And that's why I think we're going to have to start relying on more than just one species to do the heavy lifting for us right now. It's going to take a community approach because we have a dynamic system, as was mentioned. Water level is critical to maintaining wetland vegetation over long term. So we need species that are more transitional. And that Carex aetheroides sluice sedge that I talked about growing in the nursery is transitional. And I think getting some of and what I mean by that, it's able to tolerate very wet and very dry conditions. And it's long lasting and persistent and highly competitive. We need to use some of these transitional species in a community context. And I think that will help us prevent some of these secondary invasion events. But even in Walter Cottom's day, he has some really nice historic images that I'm hoping are able to be found online for those that are interested. But he shows some of these mudflat invasion communities, particularly in Provo Bay, and some of the species you talk about were even present in his time. And unfortunately, from an invasive species context, it's very difficult to manage for all niches, particularly in these mudflat communities. And I think we just have to accept we'll never be all native. We just have to have a community that's mostly native. And why does native matter? Because for our community ecology, for the birds, for the insects, for all elements of the food web, we need to have native vegetation because these are complex relationships that our native fauna has formed with the flora. And getting those relationships in place will be critical to maintaining a healthy ecosystem.
Okay, great. I know we have a lot of questions, it seems like. We only have like 1 or 2 minutes. I just wanted to see if anyone had any questions for Kevin while he's up here. I know, I know. If anyone has any questions related to ecosystem stuff for Kevin, that would be great. And then please find Blake. He's got all the answers, man. But if anyone has any questions for Kevin, that'd be really great.
Put me on the spot.
Kevin, you showed us a great photo of some rooted vegetation. Is this something that you're regularly measuring, and for how many years? How excited should we be about this?
It is something that's been on the lake for many, many years. Probably back, well, I don't know if it was there when Cottom was there, but yeah, there's 12 sites around the lake. We sample for aquatic vegetation. And we didn't find any for years until I think it was 2016. As Tim showed, that's about when the carp biomass was starting to get really low. And then we saw even more in 2017, and we've seen even more over recent years. So it is exciting, but the density has been very low. Ideally, we would like to see that spread to to high densities to kind of stabilize the sediment and provide, cover for insects and small fish. But yeah, it is exciting.
All right. Well, that is about all the time we have for questions. Oh, sorry, Sarah.
I was
Go
going to
ahead.
ask Kevin one more question, but
Okay. Sarah's already got the mic, so we'll let Sarah ask a question.
I was wondering if you guys had put any thought into how we might be able to expand those beds of rooted submerged macrophytes, whether something similar to what Blake was talking about, or I don't know, something like that. I know lake level also highly affects that rooted macrophytes.
Yeah,
also.
I know that people have tried to actively plant sago pondweed is the submerged vegetation we've been seeing. I don't know how that would work out on Utah Lake with the lake level issues and the wind and wave action. So I think getting someone involved like you wanted to try to actively plant some. You could also try wind breakers.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, everybody. You guys have amazing questions. And again, please feel free to snag our presenters in our breaks. So we are going to start our break right now. We'll come back right about 11-ish. So again, get snacks, do whatever, hang out for 10 minutes, give your brain a rest. All right. Well, super glad to be kind of going into last thing before lunch. Everybody bear with us, but we have some really exciting topics coming up. So I am happy to introduce kind of our next section about our nature center that we touched on a little bit yesterday. Luke is going to give a little bit more detail about that, so I will hand off the emceeing to him.
Thank you, Addy. Yeah, so It's my pleasure to introduce our keynotes here, Malissa, Fifita, and Robert Christensen. I've had the pleasure of working with them over the summer, and they've been a great team. Melissa's done a lot of great work. She'll be presenting on looking at nature centers, lake-focused nature centers out there. If you were here yesterday, we talked a lot about nature centers, and it is our hope to continue the progress we're making toward building a Utah Lake Nature Center. But in order to get there, I feel it was important that we actually do some research. I'm a nerd that way, and so I said, let's go and benchmark, look at what all the other focused nature centers across the country are doing. How do they get funded? All that sort of thing, and ask those questions. So that's what Melissa's going to be presenting on. Alex up here, who spoke yesterday, and Alex, he is the director of the Tahoe Environmental Research Center. So when we get to Q&A, he can ask any questions from the perspective of somebody who actually runs one. With that, Melissa, I'm going to hand it over to you. Do you want in the thing?
Hello, everyone. My name is Malissa Fifita, as Lucas said. I am a first-year doctoral student at The Ohio State University. I worked on this project during the summer under the supervision of Dr. Christensen, and I'm excited to share the findings and also to learn from the questions that are going to be asked at the end. Our agenda for today, I'm going to be introducing the 4 categories and the themes and examples from the responses on the interviewees, the type of collaboration to recommend, overall recommendation, and conclusion, and we'll save the last few minutes for a question. A key part of the Utah Lake Master Plan is building the Utah Lake Research Facility, which is the purpose or the reason why we conducted the project, focused on centers across the nation that are studying and doing research on a body of water or a lake. So we use a comparative analysis of similar water-focused center to find practical solutions in working towards implementing the Utah Lake Center. Based on the responses and the data that we collected, we recommend a collaborative model to assist the Lake Authority in implementing the Applied Research Center. Based on the interviewees' responses, we suggest 5 collaborative initiatives for Utah Lakes Nature Center, which is community, scientific, managerial and operational, fiscal, and implementation and performance collaboration. And we'll go into details in the next few slides of what it would look like from a perspective of collaborative initiatives. For our methods, we use a qualitative method where we compiled a list of centers and institutions across the nation that are studying and research on a body of water. And we collected the list into an Excel sheet and selected 7 institutions contact. And from the 7, we focused on contacting either the executive director of those centers or researchers or scientists doing research in these lakes, just to get different perspective from a director who runs the whole center and also a researcher who's doing work as in their perspective. As we collected and contact these centers, we created 15 questions based on 4 categories: their mission and their purpose of the center, the funding that they get to run the projects or the center, the research questions that they ask, or the projects that they're running in their center, and lastly, how does their center function, or how is it structured to move those projects and those research forward? As I mentioned, we like 7 institutions or centers across the nation. We also wanted to look into perspectives from within Utah. So we contact 2 nonprofits that are doing around Utah Lake or collaborating with people that are doing in Utah Lake, and also 4 Utah State agencies, just to get their perspective of what are works that are already been doing for Utah Lake or projects that are ongoing, As for crunch for time, I couldn't contact everyone. I wish I would have contacted all the scientists and the works that I've heard today in this morning about the work that is being done in Utah. But during the summer, it was summer, guys. It was hot and everybody was crunching for time. As I mentioned before, 15 questions were based on these 4 categories, and these 4 categories are mission and purpose, research focus and management, funding and resource allocation, performance measurement, policy and operations. Under those 4 categories are the 5 types of collaborative initiatives that we recommend the centers and institutions that agreed. You can see some of them are, one of them is privately owned, which is the Jones Center, and the rest are under a university, and some are nonprofit, which example would Funnel Lake and Deseret Research Institution. Those are nonprofit centers. As for mission, as we go into the categories, for mission and purpose, these were the questions. Under this category is describing their mission, the mission of their organization. How does your organization measure whether it's achieving that mission? How do they adjust if the mission is not accomplished, or it doesn't fulfill its potential purpose? And lastly, how has it evolved throughout the years? As we learn, lake changes, the environment changes, people changes, and does their mission change as well? Based on the responses on the interviewees, 3 themes came from the responses, which is strategic leadership and organizational management, research and environmental stewardship, community engagement, and outreach. As we asked these interviewees about their mission of their organization and what they look for to find success in the work that they're doing, they all respond and went back to strategic planning, making sure that they're planning the work that they're doing and setting goals to hit those plans. And if those goals are not being met, they change the strategy to fit the issue that is happening in their center. And if the strategy doesn't happen, they change it again, making sure they're adapting as well. Another part of their responses is long-term data collection. Flathead dates back to 1970 as the data collection of like long-term data of how their lake has evolved throughout time and the changes that has happened. It helps them make plan on what is their next initiative or what is their next plan for the lake. There is leadership. They went back to making understanding that the leader in a center is crucial to achieving the purpose and the mission of their center and organization. Understanding that leaders does not only manage the internal affairs of the team that is in the center, but also the external, which are the stakeholders who are funding the projects, and the community. The community is a crucial part of the mission of these centers. The second theme that came from this category is research and environmental stewards, making sure that the work that they're doing are impacting the environment, impacting the body of water that they're working towards, making sure they stay as healthy. The last, community engagement and outreach. Effective outreach and education are critical components of these organizations' mission. They share that throughout time they realize that the work that they're doing is important, but they're not communicating it. They're not communicating it effectively to the people, to the community. Science is important. The work that you're doing to keep the lake healthy is crucial, but how are they communicating it to the community? Community, they don't understand science. They want it in a very accessible way. For example, Flathead, every end of the month, they send out a fact sheet. And in these fact sheets, they put accessible and understandable language that the community can understand and read. And by that, they could enact and make sure that individuals are being stewards, working towards accomplishing the mission of the center. The second category is research focus and management, and these were the questions on this category. Are the research questions, what are the research questions that the center pursue? How do they ensure that these questions are effectively studied? what model does this organization use? If it's a university, is it a student model, or is it a scientist or a researcher with a student? We also wanted to know, how does these research that they're doing or the project that they're working on has actionable application or benefits to the body of water that they're working on. And based responses from these interviewees is research prioritization and focus, collaborative and applied research, education, outreach, and community engagement. Again, going back to part about educating the public, it's crucial. As research prioritization and focus, projects often blend with faculty expertise and interests, enabling a specialized research and broader exploration of relevant questions. Pairing expert researcher and expert science with a student makes it push the project forward, making sure that there's an impact to the body of water that they're focusing on. Tom Bansack from Flathead also shared that even though sometimes a bottom-up approach is good for students to learn, but to make sure that the project is moving forward, it has to be hierarchical, it has to be top-down, and making sure that it's hitting the goals that they want, it's applying the body of water that they're working on. The second theme that came was collaborative and applied research. Collaboration is a cornerstone of research efforts involving partnership with universities, federal and state agencies, and local communities. Applied research is a significant focus, particularly regarding practical outcomes that could inform management practices. As those ground rules of the project that you're working on in Utah Lake, as you make progress, can inform how those actions that you're doing, okay, is it working? Is it not? And you can talk back to the directors of your program and making sure that it's efficient in a way that it can inform other management decisions from the leaders and also the scientists. Lastly is education and outreach and community engagement. For Lake Tahoe and also for Flathead, they do open house where they invite the community to come out and get the work that they're doing. They do invite them out to come to a field station and also to sit in open house and learn of the work that the researchers are doing. And from that, it's creating individuals to become aware of their actions and making sure that the community knows, okay, this action is affecting the lake, I need to stop, or it's just individual stewards. These education outreach and are part of the mission, which programs ranging from K-12 to graduate level, as well as community engagement initiatives. The idea is raise awareness, build capacity, and involve the public in conservation efforts. The third and most crucial, I would say, part of this project is asking about their funding and resource allocation. Were only two questions, and they were the most important question is, how is the organization funded to fulfill its mission? How is the future moving forward? And the second would be, if funds are available for a project, how do you select a project to focus on? Three themes from the responses were funding and financial sustainability, collaboration and resource sharing, programmatic focus, and community engagement. Funding and financial sustainability was the first theme, and many organizations depend on federal, state, and private funding to sustain their operations. For instance, DRI significant funding from the Department of Defense, Department of Interior, and NFS. And some institution like Mono Lake or the nonprofit centers they rely on generating their own revenue. And some of them are under a university. And Tom Bensick shared an example, and he just gave this as an example of why they generate their own revenue, is because if the university decides that they cut 10% of their budget, the funding that they generate can cover the operational costs, and it will still push their research forward, so the project forward, and with nothing to stop those work moving forward. Again, there is a sense of security research when there's an ongoing funding source happening, making sure that those research, the work that you're doing as scientists and researchers, moving forward. We cannot do anything without secured funding. The second theme is collaboration and resource sharing. As I mentioned before, some researchers from other sectors shared that some issues that happen in their lake is happening in other lakes. So they pull their resources together to study that issue. An issue that that Flathead is looking into now is zebra mussels. So Vensec would look at other centers or other institutions that are seeing those issues, and they collaborate and pull those resources together. The last theme is programmatic focus, community engagement, going back to educating the public and making sure that the public are coming to see the work that you're doing, and making sure that not only is the work is important to the scientists and researcher, but it's also important to the people, because they are the ones who are going to go out and spread the word. This is the work that Utah Lake is doing, or my action now is going to affect whatever is going to happen to Utah Lake. So that sense of individual support and by the community and by the individual is crucial. The last category, performance measurement, policy, and operations. And this is basically asking about the structure of their organization. How do they make sure and push those projects forward? How do they measure and track their performances? What are the policy and practices that change over time? And lastly is the lesson learned. I feel that aside from funding as the top crucial lesson learned is important as well, knowing that they dedicate their life and time to study and maintain a body of water. What are the lessons learned and the challenges that they face? Three themes came from their responses, which is community and collaboration, project management and adaptation, and lastly, lessons learned and challenges. As we ask these interviewees and they respond, which is emphasize the importance of understanding and conveying research in an accessible way, ensures that communication with stakeholders and sponsors is clear and effective. There's a two-way communication. It's not only from the director of the center, the researcher, or the scientist, but it's also from the director to the stakeholders to the director, and back from the director community, making sure that there's open communication between these stakeholders. The second would be project management and adaptation, adapting to emerging threats and invasive species, and making sure that those research are paired with someone who's an expert in the field that could carry the project and make sure that it lands in an area that we want it to be, and the resources are used effectively and efficiently. As for universities, as we researchers who are on the universities, they would mention that how they track their performances is publication, publishing their putting their work into the public, and the second would be annual performance review, and lastly, Tom Bancek from head would say that when researchers come to their to do research, they would have them take surveys at the beginning and survey at the end when they leave, just to see what did they do good, and what are something that they could improve in, and what are the equipments that were useful for the work that they were doing, what are equipments they wish that could have helped the research forward, and just to see how they manage the center for a perspective of a visiting researcher. And lastly is lesson learned and challenges. Building and maintaining a strong relationship with team members, partners, and the community is crucial for the success of scientific and conservation efforts. We cannot do this alone. A center by itself cannot do it alone. It needs the help of the community, the stakeholders who are funding those projects and those research, and also scientists. They all need to feel valued and understand that the work that they're doing can and will benefit the lake if there's collaboration from all different areas, stakeholders, researcher, center, and community. As we go into the type of collaborative initiative that we recommend at the beginning, we recommend 5, and I'm going to go through them individually. The first one is community collaboration in building a strong center and community relation. Community engagement is essential for the center to build trust and align its research objectives with local needs and concern. Engagement through local constituents like citizen organizations, educational programs, public events, and advisory, making sure that we build trust with the community and working together with them to keep those projects and those research moving forward by educating them and making sure that that these are the works that are being done in Utah Lake. The second, scientific collaboration in building strong center and academic relations. We're moving from the community to the university and the academic areas. We're establishing a foundation collaboration between the research center and academic institution can lead to mutual growth and knowledge exchange. This can lead to joint grant applications, shared facilities, and research initiatives. We're not only doing research to make sure that Utah Lake is healthy and thriving, but we are also opting into educating students because they are the future, and to push the work forward and the research forward, we need those students to come and understand what's happening at Utah Lake and work with those scientists. The third collaborative initiative is managerial and operational collaboration in staff to ensure smooth operations. Evolving staff and decision-making can enhance job satisfaction and performance, directly benefiting the center's success. The staff needs to feel valued. The work that you're doing as scientists is important, it's crucial, and you need to be heard. So managing and making sure that the center or the manager or the director of the center knows that those staffs are doing work out in the sun, collecting data and making sure that they're working towards a future of a healthy Utah Lake, crucial. The fourth is, as I mentioned before, beneficial for the center is the financial collaboration. Fiscal collaboration is securing ongoing permanent funding. Establishing robust permanent funding is crucial for the sustainability of the center. Collaborating with local governments, state agencies, universities, federal sources, and private organizations will provide a diverse funding that ensures long-term sustainability. As evident in feedback from the interviewees, who highlighted that the success of centers that maintain consistent collaborative efforts in securing financial support. We cannot do work as much as we want to do research and projects with as much as we want to do it. We have that fire, but we need some backup. Lastly, is implementation. The last collaborative initiative is implementation and performance collaboration. Implementation requires a cohesive approach where multiple stakeholders, from policymakers to researchers, citizens, work together to ensure that centers' initiatives are executed efficiently. Regular performance evaluation should involve collaborative discussions with academic, government, and community partners where there's constant feedback from not only the scientists to the center, so the center to stakeholders and to the community, and the community back to the center, making sure that they know that they're valued and the stakeholders know where the fundings are going, how is it being used. So there's that cohesive approach and collaborative action. Our overall recommendation and conclusion based on this, participants revealed that collaboration is a common model among these organizations. The 5 types of collaborative initiatives, which are community and scientific, managerial and operational, financial, and implementation and performance collaboration, will best facilitate success in Utah Lake's thriving ecosystems, world-class recreation, and vibrant communities. We are ready for your questions.
Okay, great. Thank you, Melissa. That was amazing. So we are going to have these guys up here answer any questions similar to the panel style we've been doing already today. So please feel free if you have any questions about any of this. We also have Alex up here from yesterday, and he's somebody who actually works and runs one of these institutes. So again, he has this experience already as well. So he's happy to answer questions too. So again, any questions? Please begin.
Hi, thanks. That was a great presentation. w- I'm wondering how or what the recommendations are for, I guess maybe this is a two-part question. First, specific recommendations for how you direct research. There are a lot of different interests on the lake. Um, there's the June Sucker Recovery Program. There's other state agencies, water quality, the Utah Lake Water Quality Study that's ongoing, the new Utah Lake study that Forest Fire and State Lands will be undertaking, um, and existing research, both at UVU but other universities. And at USU. So again, how do you direct that research to get, meet everybody's priorities, especially if you're relying on funding from a variety of institutions? And also, how do you incorporate um, the ongoing partnerships that we have? Like, for example, the June Sucker Recovery Program has a really long-standing relationship with professors at USU, and we do work really the direct management of Utah fisheries and the recovery of June sucker. So I'm just kind of curious, as we take a step out, I love the idea of a broader partnership, but how do we utilize the existing partnerships and collaborations and make sure that we're strategically guiding research to meet the needs of, multiple management agencies and different interests?
So your question sort of reveals the answer, right? Which is first you've got to recognize that there's long-standing interests and that there are also interests that are sort of on the horizon. And so a future nature center here would have to take a good accounting for that and make sure that there's a conversation, multiple conversations to not only identify those, but to sort of agree collectively where do we want to spread limited resources, right? And to make sure all those voices are heard. So I think you've done a really nice job illustrating the problem. We don't have an exact answer, of course, but we would have advice to future nature center directors. Great question. Thank you. Do you have anything to add to that? We've had to do that.
I was going to add to that. And so I think the question comes down to, at least for us, what is a research institute? And what does it mean to be a research institute where you're at the forefront of change? And there are projects that come up that you don't know the answers to. And then you have these longer term projects that tie into agency priorities that aren't necessary research, or that they want answers on a much faster timescale than you're able to provide through longer term research. So there's actually two competing pools of money and thought with that. And the first is what we're talking about, these long-term priorities and long-term programs. That's one thing that sort of forms a core of what we do. And then the other thing is taking advantage of new things that are happening. And for example, for us, we had the first discovery of the New Zealand mud snail in Lake Tahoe last year, and all of a sudden there's all this need to try to do New Zealand mud snail, and we don't know what the implications are for the ecosystem yet. We don't know how things are going to change, but we do know that there's money available now to pursue these questions. Then the second, so part of it's financial, but then the other part of it is engagement with faculty, regardless of the institute. And so where you're trying to bring faculty and the power that they bring with students and their postdocs and their project scientists and their equipment and the questions to your institute. And so I had a conversation yesterday about how do you do that? Put it at one university. Do we need a university, or can we do this remotely? And the answer is you have to create an identity around an institute that people want to come there and do the research, do these projects, both short term and long term. That's all tied into how the money flows, and questions will come and go. And some will be good and some will be less good. And you hope, and then you move on to whatever the next one comes down the road with. Great question.
So my question, Lex, you and I were talking on finance and making sure you have sufficient budget. It looks like on Utah Lake Authority, they've acquired 2.5 million ongoing. I don't know where that's coming from. Is that? Oh, oh. Either way, yeah, you have about a $4 million a year budget. And can you talk about how many employees and what the budgeting process is and how you plan for that through students and how much is full-time employees and how you manage that?
Ooh, that's a loaded question. So when we were talking, you actually came up and said, "Well, I took you 2 billion over the last 60 years, so 30 years." So when I mentioned the number 2 billion yesterday, that's for the entire Lake Tahoe Restoration Act and all the funds that have come there. We don't get money. I wish we did. So then I was commenting over breakfast this morning that our core operating budget is about 4 million, of which about 1 million comes the Office of Research of our university. And as people are often surprised to hear this, the University of California gets very little money from the state. So we actually get about 8% of our total budget from the state. And the Office of Research, they get their income from the indirect costs from research projects across the campus that then go out to our various research units. So our research unit underneath that, so this 1 million comes from there each year. That supports about 6 staff. In total, we have 23 staff, and currently that run our chemistry labs, our field team, our terrestrial team, and then we have another modeling team that's down on our main campus. All the rest of those people come from soft money. So for those of you that don't know the terminology in academia of soft money, it means you have to raise the money from projects each year. So we are going out and trying to get research projects, raise funds, and that then we pay a percentage back to the university that eventually comes back to us, and then the other portion covers salaries that we embed into our projects to accomplish the work. So it is one of the major challenges we have is financing the people to do the work. We are lucky tying into sort of longer scale or longer term monitoring is we have agency buy-in for longer term projects. And so a couple of our bigger projects in Lake Tahoe itself comes from agencies that we have a long-term agreement so that help support our chemistry team. Then the other thing that we do is that we actually, in addition to research projects, we have developed facilities that are unique. So for example, with chemistry, we are working at detection limits below which most commercial companies can actually provide reliable results with. So we are known for extremely low nutrient detections. And because of that, we actually have people that send us samples, USGS, Desert Research Institute. They'll send us samples that we'll actually we'll just charge out at a cost recovery basis. And then that goes to help subsidize our chemistry labs. The other thing, so this is all sort of logistics on sort of an annual operating budget. The other thing is infrastructure. How do you replace infrastructure? And luckily, that's actually kind of easier in some ways. Easier for small pieces of equipment, less easy for large pieces of equipment. And why I say it's easy is because it's easy to write into a grant or a contract that you are going to buy equipment one time. A donor likes naming that they will have the mass spectrophotometer named after them. And then they'll get mass spectrophotometer in the lab and it'll be donated by so-and-so. But to then say, well, would you be willing to pay for ongoing maintenance and insurance for that mass spectrophotometer for the next 5 years? And they say, oh, no. And it's the same thing with politicians, that politicians, we're happy to raise money for boats. This is a major challenge for us. Buildings, naming things. We had a donor come through and name a urinal, uh, which she did it just to annoy her ex-husband. But she was willing to like contribute to funds as a one-off thing. And so this is what we need to be looking at, is a model where we're funding beyond one-offs, because infrastructure depreciates. And we need to be able to manage that. And then it's also in the mentality. And so when you think about what a research center is, and that you're really a research center and you're not necessarily a field station. And field stations are different, but you have to think bigger than here. Otherwise, you become a field station. And then you try to bring in various agencies, you try to bring in various universities, and buy-in from the different departments and faculties and colleges that will then potentially contribute funds to support what that research center is about. Good question. What's that? Any other questions?
Did you find that any of the centers had like advisory boards?
I did not ask for that question. It wasn't part of the data, but they do mention that stakeholders do weigh in on the decisions on projects because they're the ones funding those projects.
Can I follow up on that as well?
Yeah.
So we have an advisory board that formed in 2018, and they're great. And they're great, and where they've been really good is raising awareness from the philanthropic community. And not necessarily guiding the science, although sometimes we need to remind them that they're not necessarily guiding the science, getting their buy-in and helping communicate out to a different group than we typically get access to. And our advisory board has been great for raising funds, has been great for engaging with the public, and they step up and they contribute a lot, many different forms. And so it's not just financial. It's, I talked about the circumnavigation that we do. That is run entirely by our advisory board. And they are not raising funds from it, but people buy into it to participate. And they end up having a donor party at the end of it where they match funds for anybody that's participated that wants to donate to the center. They are also, I also picked the example of one of the board members who has a helicopter. And that's not everybody. That's a very unique circumstance to be like, oh, I have a helicopter. How can I use it for your research? But it's definitely, without that management of the board and having the buy-in from the board, he wouldn't have contributed that. And it also takes stewardship of the board so that they feel valued. So it's this two-way discussion between the board and with the scientists, and making sure that they value in us having them there. Oh, yes. They are generally retired CEOs or Silicon Valley folks, and it's always shocking to me where they've come from and their ideas. I was working with one board member about our data management because we were trying to figure out how to get data management publicly accessible and online. And he's like, oh, well, I actually wrote the software for this massive company that does all the data management. And he came in the next week with an entire proposed data plan for us. And it's a variety of unique skill sets that you see there. And we do see a rotation on our board as well, because we have board members that basically are non-participatory, and that we gently nudge them off. So we really want participation. And so having on a board, having a really good chair that buys into the science and communicates with the board is really important. And so, for example, we have an amazing docent program in our nature center, and one of the folks there came through the docent program and is now the chair of the board. So he understands the science. He's been with us for 12 years, I think, but knows everybody on the board as well. He's friends with most of them, and has been great, sort of facilitating. Sometimes when the scientists and the engineers don't communicate as well as they can, he steps in very swiftly and says, "Well, did you think about this?" and guides them over to a better conversation. Yep.
While we're transitioning, let me just underscore with all of these things, with a board, without a board, you want to have capacity if you're going to include a board. And you mentioned this, Alex. You need capacity to manage it well. If you're not going to be a field station, but a nature center, you need to have the capacity to be able to host a variety of different interests. And so those capacities, of course, don't come free. They require resources. And sometimes you're lucky in the short term, but I don't think you could rely totally on just the luck of the right board or the right mix of scientists that are interested in Utah Lake. You want to plan for that if you want long-term sustainability.
All right. Well, I think we're going to wrap up the questions. Thank you guys so much for coming and doing all this. You guys are our kind of specialty speakers, which is very fun. So now we are going to wrap up for our lunch. It's not quite out yet, so please feel free to break, mingle while it kind of gets ready, sort of thing. Yeah, and give a big round of applause, guys. Further updates about these and get a little bit more in needs than we did yesterday. So first up, we are going to have Hannah Bond, Division of Water Quality. She's going to share some very nice information about harmful algal blooms.
Good morning. Thanks, Addy. Great to see a lot of faces from yesterday. I'm excited to have a little bit more time to talk about harmful algal blooms on Utah Lake. Just a brief introduction to those of you who were not here yesterday. My name is Hannah Bonner, and I work with the Division of Water Quality as the lead coordinator for the state's harmful algal bloom program. But actually, I want to channel my inner Luke for a second and start by showing you this photo of Trader Joe's butternut squash ravioli. Several months ago, I got violent poisoning after eating this ravioli. I'm not trying to throw shade at Trader Joe's, but I generally consider myself a pretty clean and hygienic person. But 3 hours into this food poisoning and everything that came with it, those words would not describe me. Probably you could call me pretty icky, gross, maybe even toxic. Not a nice time. And it's not that I consider myself a toxic or icky person, but those were symptoms of my food poisoning that were manifesting as my body tried to get back to a state of health and equilibrium. And I think this is pertinent because this is a photo of Utah Lake this past June experiencing a harmful algal bloom. And to many members of the public, they see an image or a scene like this. The word they may use to describe Utah Lake could be icky, gross, maybe even toxic. And while things are true objectively of harmful algal bloom, they're not the most sightly or best smelling sort of things. They often are toxic. Those things are not true of Utah Lake itself. Rather, harmful algal blooms are a symptom of overall lake health. And in the same way that, my vomiting was a symptom of my food poisoning, I think it's really important and helpful to think about harmful algal blooms as a symptom of Utah Lake's health. And that allows us to recognize that blooms are not Utah Lake, they're not the idea of Utah Lake, but rather they're a manifestation of health that can give us really helpful and useful information as we understand how to be good stewards and neighbors of the lake. I almost like to think about it in the same way that a doctor uses a stethoscope to listen to your heart or your lungs. we're able to use harmful algal blooms as a pulse, as a vital sign of the lake. And so just to kind of backtrack here, I think as we think harmful algal blooms as a symptom, how do lakes in the first place? In the same way that if you eat sketchy food, more likely to get food poisoning, what are the predisposing factors that make it more likely for a lake to be dominated or form harmful algal blooms? First, as many in this room are familiar with, excess nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, really feed explosive phytoplankton growth and are a really common precursor to harmful algal bloom development. We know that Utah Lake has had a long history of excessive nutrient input, and this can be everything, raw sewage to treated wastewater to stormwater to agricultural runoff to watershed management, etc., that build up excessive nutrients in the lake over time. Another common precursor is because of photo. And so as Utah is experiencing warmer, sunnier summers and falls, this October being a great example, there's room for more harmful algal bloom development at the lake. And then finally, disturbance. Cyanobacteria is very much a generalist in most cases. And so when a water body is really stable for a long time, more specialized phytoplankton can often outcompete cyanobacteria. But when there's disturbance, which is often related to human activities, that creates a space for cyanobacteria to come in and to dominate a system. And Salt Lake has experienced all three of those things over its history, and thus has become very predisposed to forming harmful algal blooms. It's really cool, though, that we have so much research that is looking at the history of the lake and seeking to understand how what we see now has changed from the past. And we've touched on this in a few talks, but just gonna quickly go through some really cool sediment core studies that have been done as part of our lake water quality study that Scott will be talking about later this afternoon. And I'm going to be giving a summarized cyanobacteria focused version, but if you're curious to see the references and read the full report, this code will take you to it. But basically, we're able to look at these sediment cores, see that pre-1890s, Utah Lake had relatively low cyanobacteria production. Dominantly, we're seeing benthic diatoms in these and extensive regions of macrophytes or vegetation. This starts to change in the 1880s through 1940s, as a lot of things do, as we have, I'm sorry, those emojis got weird on this screen, but exponential population growth in the watershed, so a lot more nutrients, a lot more defense, and then the introduction of carp to Utah Lake. At this time, we see abrupt and quite significant increase in cyanobacteria and also the loss of those aquatic plants. That then takes us on to the 1945s and on, where there's actually a second transition we see in sediment core records, with cyanobacteria reaching an even greater concentration, which is actually significantly correlated to population growth in the watershed around Utah Lake, which again is introducing those things that predispose a water body to bloom formation, so more disturbance, more nutrient input. The good news, though, is that this is a symposium about Utah Lake 2.0, and there's some good news at the very top of these sediment cores. We actually are seeing now the reappearance of some of these macrophytes, and also a lot of research, some of what I've already talked about, is showing us that Utah Lake is a resilient water body that can still move towards health. So we have this challenge. We have some of the highest levels of cyanobacteria that probably have ever been present at the lake. Whether we're already seeing or not is still a question we're trying to figure out, but we do see that it's possible, and really a reversal of this cycle that we've seen in the last few hundred years. And part of just to tie into some of the other presentations we've seen at this symposium, we talked about these things that predispose a lake to forming harmful blooms, and a lot of effort and momentum just addressing both point and non-point sources. There's some major reductions in wastewater treatment plant effluent coming online next year. One of the things highlighted on the handouts. And then as well on the disturbance front, we've heard about so many incredible restoration projects, things like the Provo River Delta, vegetation improvements, carp removal, all which are reducing disturbance. And again, addressing the root cause that ultimately is manifesting as one of its symptoms of harmful algal blooms. So why do we monitor for harmful algal blooms? Is a vital sign we can look at to understand the trajectory of the lake and also to celebrate and measure the efficacy of all these other efforts. I want to talk a little bit about the monitoring data that we've seen on Utah Lake this past. So we routinely monitor the lake about weekly to bi-weekly, May through the end of October, at locations specifically targeted to protect recreation. So last year, this summer, we collected 98 different samples so far on Utah Lake, and we're able to use this to look at dominant cyanobacteria species and genuses and trends in microcystin and other toxin production. So if we dive into the data a little bit, this graph shows our harmful algal bloom or cyanobacteria cell density. So basically the concentration of cyanobacteria in all samples we've collected this past summer as the summer progresses. This is a logarithmic scale on the y-axis. You'll see these are quite substantial differences, a lot of variability in the lake. And we see here a similar trend to what we've seen in past years. Started out with overall most locations having pretty low cyanobacteria density, and then that increased as the summer went on, with even those levels getting higher as cyanobacteria came to more and more places in the lake. I'm curious to get our data from this past week. Assume with these colder temperatures, freezing cold nights, you see a pretty quick drop and crash of the population that generally levels out the winter, and then things will start ramping up again, usually next spring or summer. Interestingly, microcystin is a liver toxin commonly produced by many cyanobacteria, went through the opposite direction this past summer, so showing across time microcystin production. And we actually had quite high microcystins early in the summer, and then that declined as the summer progressed. And this really has the fact that even among a harmful algal bloom, there's still competition between species about which will be the dominant species. Our dominant genus of cyanobacteria early in the summer was a really prolific microcystins producer. It's actually called Microtis is the genus. And then we shifted to less commonly toxic producing species later in the summer. So again, really helpful to look at these trends. And you can imagine that as we keep collecting this data for 5 years and another 10 years, we're going to be able to compare year to understand how many of these other efforts are manifesting in changes in harmful algal bloom development, toxin production, species, etc. The other reason to monitor for harmful algal blooms is to be able to have good information to the public, both to facilitate recreational connection with the lake and try and pass on good information. I talked a little bit yesterday, but we have a statewide advisory guidance that informs the advisories and the recommendations we give to the public about recreation that is based both on the density of cyanobacteria blooms, also some common toxin production. This video, that didn't load. Here we go. Maybe it will. Okay, you guys might not get this information. Sorry. Just if you were here yesterday, you got a sneak peek of the design. This summer, we got to see a variety of conditions in the lake. Again, I talked about this a little bit yesterday, but we're able to let the public know what sort of recreation is appropriate, to know, here's the areas maybe you want to avoid. Again, not either you can or can't recreate, but being able to give people a nuanced and a detail and a data-driven perspective of conditions on the lake. Yesterday in Representative Curtiff's questions, he pointed out that it'd be really helpful if there was just some spot we could go and always see what conditions were like at the lake. And I am excited to tell you that this resource actually already exists. So all of the data we collect at Utah Lake gets put on this website, habs.utah.gov. And this is actually just for Utah Lake. Harmful algal blooms do not only affect Utah Lake, but in fact have affected almost 30 water bodies in the state just this summer. So this is not an isolated problem, but we actually monitor for these around the state, and that information, as soon as we have it, is put on this website. In addition, information about how folks can help reduce their own nutrient input, images about showing harmful algal blooms around the state, and other data. So this is a really helpful resource, and one of the main ways we're able to communicate to the public that in the same way you would check the weather before you go out, you can also check the latest conditions at your lake of interest. As just a final wrap up to this, we also have been carrying out public perception survey to better understand what the average American knows and thinks about harmful algal blooms. And interesting results. First of all, we found out that most people in Utah have actually heard of harmful algal blooms. So 85% of recreation we interviewed along the Wasatch Front had heard of a bloom. Most of those are from news reports, a friend or family member, or physical signage at a water body, which I think scientists as water body managers is really helpful information. That the information we communicate to the news media, the information we post physically at our water bodies, and also just our personal interaction with other people have a lot of impact on determining what the public conscience is about harmful algal blooms on Utah Lake and other locations. And as well, people are concerned. 94% knew what a bloom was, reported some level of concern about harmful algal blooms. Unfortunately, though, I think where things start to break down is that people might know what blooms are, but their knowledge is not great right now. 40% of respondents said that they confident at recognizing a harmful algal bloom, but when we actually tested them, only 28% of respondents could actually identify a bloom in an image. And so certainly something that we're focusing efforts on and that I hope collaborators and other folks in this room in taking people's knowledge and concern about blooms and now helping them translate it to actionable data and ability and skill in being able to identify these blooms and appropriately scale the kind of choices and behaviors they exhibit. So again, wrapping up, harmful algal blooms are very much a symptom of water body health. And I think in Utah Lake's case, this beautiful idea of trying to restore and reach an equilibrium again. As we monitor for these blooms, we see how effective our restoration efforts are, and we're also able to communicate good data to the public. Just want to end with gratitude for all of your efforts to be these stethoscopes out there listening to Utah Lake, and encourage you to keep on pursuing that as we move towards a healthy lake. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you, Hannah. That was great. I do have a sad announcement that Kevin Shirtliff will not be able to make it today due to a family emergency, which is very sad. So we are gonna try to benefit from that and move our schedule up 15 minutes of presentation. So bear with us with that.
Thank you, Addy. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Scott Daly with the Division of Water Quality. I'm a watershed scientist by training. I've been working on Utah Lake for the past 10-ish years or so. In a number of capacities. I mean, the Utah Lake Water Quality Study is kind of my primary focus, but also help with the general basin coordination, non-point source management, dealing with things that arise elsewhere in the watershed on a water quality concerns. But today we're going to talk a little bit about the water quality study. It's something that the division has been working on for a number of years now. It's kind of a reboot in terms of a second effort for understanding water quality in Utah Lake. Back in the 1990s or so, we had another study to try to understand what the impacts of nutrient pollution are on the lake and harmful algal blooms and those kinds of things. And so this is kind of a continuation of that. The primary focus of this is to really understand, how we can improve and protect the ways that we use the lake. And so we all know those as recreation, as Hannah was talking about. Agricultural uses, the water from Utah Lake is used far and wide throughout the valley and into Salt Lake Valley for irrigation purposes, home residential watering and those kinds of things. And then, also our aquatic life. We need clean water in the lake to protect the fish, our native fish, June sucker, for example. And so this study has been ongoing and with the goal of trying to identify what those water quality goals should be, targets should be to help ensure that we are protecting our uses. And then I think more importantly, and what I'll focus on today is, once those are all established, what do we do about it? How do we get there? What practices can we employ in the lake to actually make improvements? And sorry for the graphics. These were supposed to be kind of percent completions of the various phases of the project. But like I mentioned, we kicked this off in 2015. Initial data gathering phase, structuring our stakeholder process, making sure that the right members of the community are at the table, the right scientists from the community are at the table to help understand the problem. We wrapped that up. It's 100% complete in 2018. And then moving more into our phase 2, which was really the goal setting phase. What constitutes a healthy lake? And so we've been working on that for quite a while. Recently, just wrapping up our focused research program. So several years of targeted research to understand the lake sediments, where nutrients are coming from, how they're processed in the lake, development of water quality models that'll help us forecast into the future what kind of improvements we can make in the lake, and how to get there. And so that just wrapped up earlier this spring, and then we're nearly complete with our criteria development. So this is the part where we're identifying those targets or those goals that we need to achieve in the lake to make sure that we're protecting our beneficial uses. And then this phase 3, this is where I'd like to spend most of our time today. It started with kind of mapping out all of the various things that the stakeholders wanted to see in a remediation plan, water quality remediation plan. And then where we're at now is just starting to kick off an effort to develop that plan, unpack and investigate those things that were identified by the stakeholders, and really identify the management strategies and put together a comprehensive plan. Okay. So one of the first things, and I think one of the things that comes up in a lot of the talks that we heard today is, what are we managing the lake for? And we heard lots of great talks about, management for June sucker and for vegetation, for harmful algal blooms. But having a common understanding of what water quality goals in the lake should be is kind of the first step. We need to know where we're shooting for to be able to understand how to get there. And so part of the water quality study a couple years ago was to really unpack those 3 uses that we talked about more explicitly. Stakeholders came up with a list of 35 different ways that they see aquatic life. Specifically, protecting for June sucker was one of them, reproduction of June sucker and habitat conditions and those kinds of things. And so that's a really important first step. And that was then passed on to the Utah Lake Authority's management plan that was recently completed this past spring that we heard about already. So understanding where we're going and developing those goals is a really important first step in trying to improve conditions in the lake. So the process that we're about to embark on, is really about, identifying what can be done to the lake, how much improvement can we make, how practical is it, how effective is it, is it cost prohibitive, are the practices feasible, being flexible and adaptive. So those are all really important things for a management plan that will be addressed as we're kind of going through this planning process that's mapped out here on the bottom. And for those of you that have been involved in watershed restoration planning in other areas or are familiar with it, it's really not a novel concept. There are several unique things in Utah Lake where we have to take some additional steps and explore add some additional tasks and do some additional research and things. But this is a well-vetted study that's for process has been implemented elsewhere in other watersheds in Utah even that have led to improvements in water quality in other local lakes and reservoirs. Okay, so water quality in Utah Lake. I mean, I think we started to get here this morning. There's 2 compartments, I guess, the way that I think about it in the lake. And water quality in the lake is affected by the inputs from the watershed and also the ecosystem structure within the lake itself. And we heard a lot about the ecosystem structure in the lake this morning. But for the watershed components, as Hannah mentioned, there's several different areas where nutrients will come from within the watershed. And we break those down into non-point sources. So these are dispersed land uses, forest management, where there's just general runoff of nutrients and other things coming into the lake. Point sources, these are pretty apparent, I think, to everyone. We're just concentrated sources. These are depends how you think of stormwater, but stormwater is sometimes considered a point source. Any industrial sources that are discharged through a pipe, wastewater effluent, and those kinds of things. Stormwater management, super important. And in my mind, I think growth. And as we all understand, growth in Utah Valley and where it's projected to go over the next 20 to 30 years, that growth is probably going to be the most important factor in designing a watershed restoration plan, a nutrient reduction plan for the lake. Okay, and so for the in-lake stuff, these are all the things that we talked about this morning. we talked about carp management and vegetation management in the context of achieving other goals for the June sucker recovery program, for recreational access and improving wetlands around the lake. Turns out those things are equally important for the water quality puzzle in Utah Lake. And we need to be addressing those components to be able to help help realize the benefits of the nutrient management practices that we'd be implementing in the watershed itself. And then, the last one here, last two, nutrient recycling. So, once nutrients are in the lake, most of them come from the watershed, land in the lake, and then they can be available to be reprocessed, grow additional algae in the lake. And then, so understanding what to do with the sediments and how to address the nutrient recycling component will be something to unpack in terms of identifying effective strategies. And then biological chemical treatments, mechanical treatments. I think we would have heard from Kevin um, about some mechanical treatments that he's exploring for physically removing algae from the lake. And so those kinds of things are all on the table for, taking a multiple faceted approach for addressing water quality problems, basically from every direction. Okay. The good news is we, really have gotten a step up on, tackling some of these problems already. We've been struggling with water quality issues in Utah Lake for a long time. But we're at a point within the last 10 years where there has been significant investment focused to the lake, and we continue to get additional investments and additional interest from our community in making improvements in the lake. And this is by no means an exhaustive list of things that have been happening, but um, new methods for managing stormwater through low impact development and reducing nutrients from storm flows into the lake. That's a new endeavor with Division of Water Quality and our stormwater management program, and all of our communities are adapting these types of practices today for new construction, which will have an impact as we move to the future in the lake. Um, Provo River non-point source, through our partners with the Provo River Watershed Council and other watershed groups, there's been significant investment in watershed restoration practices, non-point source reductions in the middle and upper Provo rivers, Walsburg area, even the Spanish Fork River, where there's been some new investments over the last 5 to 10 years. I expect those to continue to grow as we understand more about how to improve the watershed. And then, as Hannah mentioned, we're at a point where some new rules will go into effect next year, and all of our wastewater plants will meet a new set of limits, which will result in about a 60% reduction in total phosphorus to the lake from today. But will happen next year. So huge improvements. And the $30 million that Hannah mentioned, I have a little bit of a slide on that. That's in terms of investments made into publicly owned treatment works is really just the tip of the iceberg. There's been tens, hundreds of more millions of dollars invested into kind of getting us to this point where we can realize those reductions. The Provo River and Hobble Creek deltas, we heard a lot about those this morning. Those were generally, they have the objectives of improving June sucker recovery goals or meeting June sucker recovery goals, but they also have the side benefit of improving overall watershed health and how the watersheds process nutrients, sequester nutrients, when they will have a big impact on flows going into the lake. And so the Preservation Fund, and I have a couple just photos here, but I'll just skip ahead to the Preservation Fund. That was a grant program that came out through the ARPA allocation of dollars a couple years ago, and there were non-point source focused dollars, I think around 8 million or so, $1 million allocated to supporting carp removal efforts in the lake, some of the education and outreach with the Utah Lake Authority, 20 million to infrastructure improvements with POTWs again, and then investments into stormwater infrastructure and a couple others that were focused in and around Utah Lake, but also in higher areas in the watershed where we expect to have some benefits to Utah Lake. So for the in-lake part, carp removal, this one's huge, and I borrowed an old graphic from the June sucker recovery program here. Carp removal is recognized as an important step to meet objectives for the June sucker recovery program. but it's also equally important, or maybe even more important, for improving the overall ecosystem of Utah Lake, just because it's the primary disturbance that we've realized in Utah Lake, and trying to mitigate the effects of carp will have incremental improvements or supplemental benefits to water quality aspects. Invasive plant management, reestablishing native vegetation in and around the lake will help us get to meeting our goals for water quality faster. Um, Management planning, several agencies and June Sucker Recovery Program, Forestry Fire State Land, coordinating all of those management agency, all those management plans help us get to achieving our goals faster. Okay, so I think that's it.
All right, well, thanks, Scott. So unfortunately, because Kevin is not here, we are moving up our schedule a little bit. So right now, we are gonna do our Q&A with Scott and Hannah. So if you guys have any questions for them, we have 10 minutes ish around there. So give them your best shot.
This is for Hannah. Back in the 70s, my friends and I water skied on Utah Lake frequently, and quite often in the fall, we called it, we assumed it was algae. It was, for lack of a better term, kind of green scum on the lake, but we didn't care. We just wanted to water ski. And to my knowledge, nobody had any ill effects by frequently skiing in what I would say now is an algal bloom. Can you speculate as to whether what we were experiencing back then was a bloom such as we experience today? And then, more importantly to me, I kind of thought was skilled at perhaps identifying an algal bloom until I saw those statistics and realized I may fall in the other category where I can't. Can one develop a skill because it's so localized and we like to recreate on the lake? Can one develop that skill to identify a bloom that could be harmful?
Yeah, those are fabulous questions. Thank you so much. It's I cannot accurately speculate on exactly what you were water skiing through in the 70s. And cyanobacteria is tricky. Like the graph I showed of the toxin production, toxin production can change really dramatically within a period of days to a week or so. And so you can have a surface scum that maybe doesn't have any detectable toxins one day, one weekend, and the next weekend it could be quite toxic. So, and I think that can be hard because maybe you wouldn't have any issues water skiing it that first week, but you could have issues the next. That might be part of it. And then also, generally, when we see human health issues with cyanotoxins, it comes from direct ingestion. And so it seems like, especially children, pets, seem to get the brunt of it because they're much more likely to directly ingest a lot more water than adults who are a little bit better at keeping their mouths closed when they fall into the water. So that might also have been part of your experience. And then my apologies for not including. I should have included the survey question and tested all of you, how you compare to the general public. But I certainly feel there is a skill. I mean, this is something we see every summer with our seasonal employees. We'll hire people who help monitor, and they have no idea what a bloom looks like at the start of the season, and they're spotting them everywhere by the end. And so I think just really getting experience looking at images of blooms is one of the best ways. And then there's a few really easy in the field ways to distinguish cyanobacteria from imposters like true algae, duckweed. And so I would recommend visiting that habs.utah.gov website. We have a photo gallery there and a little identification guide that can be really helpful. And I'd be happy to chat more as well and pass on some more resources.
One assume that I
Yeah, and you might have saw on there, usually we say, boating's okay, just try not to boat through really thick areas of algae because it can cause dermal irritation, so rashes. But that's pretty rare unless you're having prolonged contact. So usually boating is okay in almost all conditions.
So
what is the probability and how long would it take to get to a point where algae is not an issue on this lake?
Um, yeah, I don't know if I have numbers for you, but I personally believe that there is a lot of opportunity to improve water quality conditions in the lake. We know, as Hannah pointed out in her slides, that the harmful algal blooms are, basically the result of excess nutrients, sunlight, and disturbance. And so, to the extent that we can, remediate those things, we can have, positive impact on the lake. This is a question that the Utah Lake Science Panel is currently wrestling with to determine how long it would take to get there. And the general sense from that is one, we need to address external nutrient inputs to the lake and reduce those to the extent that we can. The level of which that we need to do that reduction is not quite known at this time. And then two, the science panel is actually wrestling with that recovery time question right now. And discussions that they are having range between, on the order of 5 years to 10 to 20 years recovery once we've addressed the root cause of the problem. So those are all, kind of preliminary estimates. I think the general thought is that once we are able to, address external nutrients, that it will have a positive impact on the lake, but the exact timing is not entirely known. Hopefully next year, this time, I have better answers for you.
Hi there. Thanks for the talks. I just had a question about internal loading. Have you looked at it and what portion of the nutrient loading is coming from internal loading processes?
Yeah, this is a point of much debate within the scientific panel that is assembled for this process. So it ranges. If you were to take multiple perspectives, it ranges from on the order of 20 to 30% to I think 250%, if I'm able to do my math correctly. But it's well recognized that the internal nutrient cycling is the result of external nutrients that were deposited into the lake. The sediment coring studies that Hannah mentioned earlier show that in areas that do have high sediment nutrient concentrations that would be most responsible for the sediment recycling are on the eastern shoreline in the areas of Provo Bay, those areas that do receive the higher nutrient loads. And the sediment cores showed that in pre-settlement time, pre-European settlement, the nutrient concentrations in the sediments were quite low, more like background soil concentrations, and have doubled to tripled in the case of Provo Bay, maybe even slightly more than that. So we expect Provo Bay to have a much higher proportion of internal loading, internal cycling. One of the interesting things, and goes to the recovery question, is the chemistry of Utah Lake is driven by calcium phosphate precipitation, and there are some ideas that may kind of expedite the recovery. Is probably resulting in that lower end recovery range of 5 years that I said. So anyway, I guess long story is there's a lot of debate around internal cycling. The proportions are kind of depending on which numbers you're looking at, but it's by and large driven by that external input into the lake.
So based on some of the reports that I've seen and, when we talked yesterday about like the messaging about harmful algal blooms and what we can do to help with public perception, it's my understanding that the harmful algal blooms tend to be concentrated on the edges, right? And particularly on the eastern side or some point sources over on the western side. Is that what we're finding from, like, is that true? I guess is the first question. Because we know that with the large surface area, right, how often does the whole lake really be affected by a harmful algal bloom, whereas it's just certain locations, and are they at locations where people can see it, right? So, like, could that be playing into public perception of the condition of the lake because you're standing on the shoreline and you see the shoreline and not in the middle of the lake where harmful algal blooms might not be actually active and a potential issue for people recreating.
Yeah, I think I'll take a first cut at that and then pass it over to Hannah. So we have two different monitoring programs that we use information to track where and when blooms occur. One is the HAB monitoring program that Hannah spoke to, and the second is more long-term systematic monitoring program that's been occurring on the lake for decades now. And so we use that information to get at this spatial question, where and when HABs occur. And the result of that work has showed that pretty conclusively, HABs are occurring more often and in higher concentrations on the eastern shoreline of the lake and in Provo Bay. The exception to that is Goshen Bay. I think you were referencing the west side. Goshen Bay experiences more blooms and higher magnitude blooms than, say, the open water of Utah Lake on the west side near Saratoga Springs. The other exception to that is probably the marina areas on the west and north side of the lake.
I agree. That was perfect. And I'll just add aesthetically, a challenge we have is when a bloom forms, you get that really thick surface scum. And so when you're in a windy place like Utah Lake, all that wind, it just shuffles that surface scum and can make extra aesthetically nasty buildups along shorelines. So like Scott said, I think there's definitely distributions, but it does seem like the marinas and beaches almost act like a catcher's mitt that just gets all that accumulated scum and can be particularly toxic and particularly gunky looking.
Hi. Yeast or nutrients have increased at all because of the removal of Phragmites on the lake?
Yeah, I don't know that we have that information, at least for Phragmites. For the case of aquatic vegetation, macrophytes, and other things, we know that they utilize nutrients in a similar way that phytoplankton or harmful algal blooms do. The difference would be that those plants would then transfer the nutrients into the root zone and then, sequester those more immediately into the sediments. So those, the types of plants we do have will affect the nutrient cycling in the lake. But yeah, I don't know that I can venture out on the effect of Phragmites removal.
It's my turn. Okay. Hi. I have a question. I heard on NPR there was a man or a company that has invented a way to some process that gets rid of algal bloom, and then he was selling these services because it was expensive as part of the carbon tax initiative. And I was wondering if you are familiar with any of that, and if it would be effective at all, or is this guy like a kook, or like what's going on? I don't know.
Yeah, that's a great question. And Scott briefly touched on kind of short-term interventions. So maybe just to set the stage, there are a number of algicides or products that can be used to kill cyanobacteria and like wipe it out really effectively. And we've actually done some pilot studies in past years on Utah Lake and some of the marinas. And what we see is that these treatments can be really helpful for short-term fixes. So I mean, we could cover Utah Lake in algicide right now and wipe out every cyanobacteria cell for like a week, and then then it would come back. And that's what our things need, because as long as we still have those predisposing ingredients, the high nutrients, the warm temperatures, the disturbance, the cyanobacteria is just going to keep on cycling. And so we found that these treatments can be really helpful. Maybe there's a big event going on in a marina and we want to really let the public have an opportunity to connect and recreate. Treatments can be really helpful for these spot checks. But going back to the illness analogy, in the same way that aspirin might help break your fever, it still isn't going to address the long-term problem. Great question.
It's my turn? Okay. I comment as much as anything. I agree with Scott that the paleo studies show that the effects of nutrients, especially phosphorus, are greater in Provo Bay and along the east shore. However, the audience ought to be aware that there are other paleo studies that have been conducted that have not been referred to. If you're interested in those, come see me after. And in the open part of the lake, two conclusions is the phosphorus content in the open part of the lake has not changed much between pre and post European settlement. And that also shows up in the reconstructions of the diatoms. You go from a benthic dominated to a planktic dominated community as the periphyton and emergent vegetation has been destroyed by carp and other things. But the inferred water column phosphorus from pre to post settlement times has remained virtually unchanged
Yeah, and
in the open part of the lake.
yeah, Dr. Nelson, apologies. I was referring to the paleo studies more broadly, including yours, because they show some pretty. Your study, for example, shows similar results in Provo Bay, and actually similar results to the other studies that are available for the open water. And I think the way that I've rationalized that, or is that there's been some extensive sediment nutrient mapping done on the lake that shows where nutrient concentrations are high and low. And my understanding is that those cores that were in the open water of the lake, are in those areas that haven't, I guess to your point, haven't accumulated nutrients as fast, because present day nutrients are much lower in those areas than present day nutrients more on the eastern shore and in Provo Bay. So I think it just speaks to the distribution or spatial variability of nutrient concentrations in the sediments across the lake, and probably speaks to the distribution of harmful algal blooms where and when they're occurring.
I've got a kind of related to that. Just to comment on that is, having been on the lake myself probably 200 times in the last 15 years, that the prevailing wind tends to move all material from the southwest to the northeast, or from the west to the east. So, certainly there is sources on the east side, but whatever's floating gets blown over and then dies and settles anyway. And a good example of that is Landom Marina is one of the worst areas for blooms anywhere on the lake. And there's no point source near Landom Marina. It's within itself recycling nutrients, and Provo Bay is largely the same thing, except it does have nutrients. But some of these areas get themselves an internal, like a microcosm of ecology. One other comment related to the time of recovery. Steve and I'm on the science panel. I'm the one person who is a questioner of data, and we've spent millions of dollars doing research on atmospheric deposition, sediment recycle, macroinvertebrates, and things, how to fix the lake. Not only what's wrong or it's a nutrient issue, whatever, but the sources and how to fix it. We believe through at least 1,500 atmospheric deposition samples that there's going to be enough nutrients, enough phosphorus, and even nitrogen fall on the lake, as well as being recycled, that it's going to be a continuing issue. No matter how much you reduce the POTWs or whatever, there's still going to be a long, lingering period where uncontrolled sources will continue. So maybe not be quite so positive, but the final result of what our work is that we're looking at ways to restore the lake. And I love the comments made this morning, about the vegetation, the SAV. So really what we got to do, what we look at mostly is we've got to secure the sediment surface. It's a huge source of nutrients. Every time a breeze blows, it disturbs that sediment and remobilizes sediments. So that's the turbidity aspect. But even then, we know there's a continual source of mobile nutrients in the pore water that diffuses into the water that will go on also in their perpetuity. And so what we need to do is apply methods, and hopefully we get into this a little bit more because we've been looking at it ourselves for years, but stabilize the sediment, reduce the carp, clear up the water, reintroduce a top-down control of the ecosystem rather than trying to do a bottom-up, because we believe, in our group anyway, that we will have a terribly difficult time trying to control nutrients from a point source or an external source. It'll just keep coming or coming out from either direction. But if you stabilize the sediments, you grow a layer of periphyton that'll provide an increased barrier of nutrient transfer into the water column, and that'll be the main thing. But ecologically, that'll also clear the water, and all predators in the lake are visual, so they will have a better chance of viewing their prey, i.e. carp. An example is how many people have been to Lake Powell, which has carp. Has there ever been a mention of carp problems in Lake Powell? No, it's clear. The predators in Lake Powell can easily take care of the carp issue. So clear water will be the issue. It's got to be stable sediment stabilization, macrophyte establishment, and that'll help restore that ecosystem to a more balanced situation. So that's what we're working on.
So again, our next section is going to be talking a little bit about water management for Utah Lake and some of the projects that go along with it. So I'm going to introduce Rachel Musil, and she is with Central Utah Water Conservancy. This one gonna work? Okay. Again, this is Rachel Musil with Central Utah Water Conservancy District, and she is gonna give us some water updates.
Thanks. So, like Addy said, I am Rachel Musil with Central Utah Water Conservancy District. I'm their water supply manager. Just as a brief overview on what the Central Utah Water Conservancy District does, we serve over 2 million people in the Wasatch Front and Uinta Basin in terms of supplying them supplemental water. We have 3 water treatment plants, 2 hydroelectric plants, 8 reservoirs that we manage, and multitudes of pipelines and canals and tunnels to convey that water to the Wasatch Front. So this is an overview map of all of the facilities that we have at Central Utah Water Conservancy District. We convey water from the Colorado River to the Wasatch Front while also supplying irrigation and in-stream flow water in the Colorado River Basin and in several stream flows along the Wasatch Front. We start that conveyance by bringing water from all the way up in Upper Stillwater, and we convey that water all the way down to Strawberry Reservoir, which is our large storage reservoir. And the majority of Strawberry Reservoir's water is actually for the Wasatch Front and is conveyed to South Utah County and to Salt Lake County. We supply 750 acre feet of M&I water. And some of that water has actually been turned back through a 207 program for in-stream flows for the purpose of recovering the June sucker. And we use that water to send flushing flows down Hobble Creek and down Provo River for the recovery of the June sucker. We supply about 40,000 acre feet of irrigation water. And then we actually have a large contract to supply about 44,400 acre feet of in-stream flow water in the Uinta Basin. We supply a lot of other water supplies, so we convey a lot of other water rights through our facilities, including the Strawberry Valley Project water down to the Strawberry Valley Project water users in South Utah County. Some of the key points that I want you guys to kind of get away from my presentation today is that Utah Lake's water rights are some of the earliest water rights in the state. In order for the Central Utah Project to function, those water rights in Utah Lake have to be fulfilled. And we need those water rights to be fulfilled so that we can deliver water to those 2 million people that we serve water to. One other key component that I want to highlight today is that through the passage of a 1990 federal law called the Central Utah Project Completion Act, we were tasked with conserving water through what's called the 207 Water Conservation Program. And that water was conserved through piping different facilities and using that piped or that saved water for environmental purposes. And that's where we got the majority of the June Sucker Recovery Implementation Program water supply is through that the 207 project water through piping different facilities. And then one other really big key thing that I want to highlight is we import a lot of water from Strawberry Reservoir. So we import a lot of Colorado River water. And that import, as it increases, as our demand increases on the Strawberry Reservoir, and we send more of that water north to Salt Lake County, that water is going to go through your home or on your lawn, and there's going to be return flow, so additional water in the basin that is supplied by that reservoir that will then return to the Great Salt Lake as more and more demand comes onto Strawberry Reservoir. And so as we continue to deliver water, we're going to actually continue to increase our benefit to the Great Salt Lake through that conveyance. Here's a big snapshot on all of our water supplies on the Wasatch Front. That shows the 70,000 acre feet that we send to Salt Lake County from Jordanelle, but also includes the 22,000 acre feet that we're going to potentially send to Salt Lake County out of Strawberry Reservoir. One key thing that I want to highlight here is this Strawberry Journal Exchange water, this Diamond Fork in-stream flow water, and all of this water here. This is our conserved water. That is water that we directly deliver from Strawberry Reservoir to Utah Lake. And we store that water in Utah Lake for the benefit of the Central Utah Project because of the water rights in Utah Lake being the most senior. So a couple of things to kind of highlight here in terms of like environmental benefits that we bring. We provide supplemental water to 2 million people, and that return flow of that water is really crucial. It actually does provide an additional benefit to both Utah Lake and to the Great Salt Lake. That return flow is return flow of water that is not naturally available to that basin. We have the Section 207 Water Conservation Program that's conserved a bunch of water. We have a ton of in-stream flow commitments. We provide environmental in-stream flows all across the Provo River, Spanish Fork, and Hobble Creek. And we were a partner in downlisting the endangered species by providing water and having that 207 program. In addition to that, we also have recreational benefits that we provide. This is just a big snapshot of what's actually coming in basin and being delivered to Utah Lake. I wanted to kind of highlight this one again, specifically because this is import water coming to the lake. And because we store this import water in Utah Lake for the benefit of the project. And in some instances, like in 2022, we had a large chunk of Utah Lake as import water. So which brings me to one of the key things that I think needs to be highlighted today and that's the Utah Lake Distribution Plan. This is a plan that was set up by the State Engineer's Office for the benefit and for the distribution of all the water rights within Utah Lake and all of the water rights on the Provo River, specifically the storage reservoirs. So one of the key things about the distribution plan is it actually allows Jordanelle and Deer Creek Reservoir to store what's called system water up in our reservoirs. And that system water is actually not water that is owned or controlled by the Jordanelle or Deer Creek. It's actually Utah Lake water. And so we're storing that Utah Lake water until Utah Lake hits certain criteria. And when Utah Lake hits certain criteria, we either have to release that water, and we could release it for highlighting some key environmental benefits using that system water for June sucker flows, or we can store that water and then use it later on because we're in priority with Utah Lake. So that distribution plan, some of the key things that I'm going to mention here. So system storage is water stored up in the reservoirs. That is owed to Utah Lake, where our priority storage is water stored in the reservoirs that is actually stored under priority under those reservoir storage water rights. And just one really big key thing I want to highlight here is that in order for us to store in Jordanelle Reservoir, Utah Lake water rights have to be satisfied. Like we have to have that as a main criteria in order for us to actually have that water in Jordanelle Reservoir. Otherwise, we have to replace that water somehow. And our main replacement mechanism is that import water that we bring from Strawberry Reservoir. Here's another big key thing. I have here an interlocutory decree that was signed in 2016 that recognizes the return flows and the import water and allows for the storage of the import water in Utah Lake. But I also wanted to highlight that Central Utah Water Conservancy District, we own about a third of the water rights that are in Utah Lake itself. We purchased those water rights in lieu of diking back in the early days. I don't know if anyone knew that diking was one of the initial concepts of the Central Utah Project, but diking was part of the initial idea around the Central Utah Project. But instead of diking, we purchased water rights. And we utilize those water rights to exchange up to Jordanelle or to utilize this Utah Lake distribution plan. As of right now, we have about 28,000 acre feet of strawberry water sitting in Utah Lake, and that's because we spilt a lot this spring. And I'll kind of highlight that a little bit more. This is a tabulation of all the water rights in Utah Lake. There's about 302,000 acre feet of water rights sitting in Utah Lake. I have 2 minutes. Oh, man. I don't think we're going back or we're going home early, so I'm going to hurry up here. I apologize. So one of the key things that Utah Lake Distribution Plan highlighted and identified was this conversion line. And this conversion line is a specific water level based off of system storage sitting in Utah Lake. And if Utah Lake hits that system storage line, then the system storage that is sitting upstream in Deer Creek and Jordanelle, it converts to priority storage. What that means is that Utah Lake is water fat and that there's available water to have those later priority water rights store their water in priority. Through a mechanism using our Utah Lake water rights, we can actually lower that line. So we forego our use of our 82,000 acre feet of Utah Lake water rights, and then we can lower that line so we can store upstream in Jordanelle. Or if there is an issue and Utah Lake is low, we have to initiate a series of different exchanges. So we'll exchange our Utah Lake water rights up to Jordanelle, or we'll exchange the strawberry water rights. And we'll do it typically in that order. We'll do Utah Lake water rights first, and then our strawberry import water. Here's just kind of highlighting a little bit of the water levels in Utah Lake and kind of the difference here. So this is the physical level. This was the level of Utah Lake in 2022 without CUP import water in the lake. We were a significant portion of the lake at the end of 2022. This was 2023 as Utah Lake filled. This is the physical level, and this is the Utah Lake without CUP import in it. And then this was this year. And so you'll see as we hit compromise, all of the CUP water spilt downstream to the Great Salt Lake. And as we drop below compromise, we continue to import water from Strawberry Reservoir on a continuous basis. And so we now have about 30,000 acre feet sitting in Utah Lake. Some other things that Central Utah Water has been doing in order to benefit the Great Salt Lake. In 2020, we actually entered into a water use donation agreement with Audubon Society. And now with an amendment, we included the Great Salt Lake Trust. This is one of the first water donation agreements for the Great Salt Lake. And we did it with Kennecott as well. That's been that was one of the first and initial actions for water donation. In 2023, we initiated a Utah Lake bypass where we utilized pipelines up Provo Canyon to convey water to the point of the mountain, where we discharged water from Provo River down to the Jordan River and bypass Utah Lake. Because one of the key issues with Utah Lake is that because there's a pumping plant and a outlet works, if we're in a situation where we're below where the natural channel will actually convey water, that the water actually has to be pumped out of Utah Lake. And so in order to bypass and eliminate that problem, we utilize the pipelines through Provo Canyon. So just kind of as a wrap up here, and I apologize, I'm probably a little bit over now. So since the passage of CUPCA, we have conserved 2.7 million acre feet. We spent $227 million on the 207 program, 1,000 acre feet of water out of Utah Lake, of import water that we had brought across from Strawberry Reservoir. And one of the things to kind of highlight here is as we continue to develop, we will continue to increase the return flows that are coming from import water, additional hydrologic water to the basin, including the water developed through Strawberry Valley Project. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Rachel. I'm so sorry for mispronouncing your last name. Forgive me. All right. Well, now we're going to hear from Eric McCulley with the Delta Project. So we're super excited to get a little bit more in depth today about it than we did yesterday. And we're happy to hear what he has to say.
Thank you. Thank you all for sticking around late in the day here, and appreciate it. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Delta Project, but first I want to recap a couple things that I heard yesterday and today. One of the tenets of what we're doing is you have to plan ahead for drought and for floods. It's really important that we think ahead and realize that we're making incremental progress. It's not going to happen all at once, but we do have to have perseverance, and we have to continue to make that incremental process, and that's impossible without strategies and planning. These are human values, the quality of life. A lot of these things we're working on are really, human-derived values, but they do benefit the natural systems. And, we're doing this side by side through collaborative efforts. And without the collaboration and the partnerships and all of you all here, we couldn't get anything done. So I appreciate that. Some of these places we're able to restore the natural functions, and that's what I'm going to talk about today with the Delta. Other places we have to use engineered solutions. And, if we fail, we have to rebound from those failures, and we have to continue to move forward and persevere again. And as Congressman Owens mentioned yesterday, you got to continue to hustle. You got to innovate and improve. You got to have passion, and you got to have effort. And we're building great memories with our families, our friends, and our colleagues out here by actually getting in there and experiencing the resources for the health of the economy. And, this is the way we do things in Utah, which is great. So we appreciate that. And I do want to mention, thank you for saying that there is a water body between Utah Lake and Great Salt Lake. And I'll leave it at that. It's an important resource as well. A lot of times it gets people don't talk much about the river that's between the two, but these are all connected systems, and that's why there's some important things going on there. So as was mentioned, Central Utah Water Project had some impacts on the environment, and our agency, the Utah Reclamation, Mitigation, and Conservation Commission, was set up to mitigate for those damages, and we have a bunch of different partners, including Central Utah Water Conservancy District, the DOI, and the June Sucker Recovery Program. We have other project partners like the DWR, Water Quality, Utah Lake Authority, city and county. It's a multi-agency effort, and we can't do it alone, so we all have to work together. It's just a quick look at the final schedule. We are opening the Delta to the public on Saturday, but we still have a couple more things to do, and then there will be ongoing things as well to work on. This is, kind of how you build a river. This is what it looked like from Lakeview Parkway, and there it is a couple years ago. And then we continue our way up, and somehow we get to having a river there, and that's the new Provo River. And then this is much more recently. You can see the trails are built and things on the sides, and a lot of cottonwoods and things like that have come in. And so it does take time. Juvenile June sucker is a big aspect of what we're doing in the Delta for June sucker. There was a bottleneck, which means a part of the life cycle of the June sucker was not available, which was going from little tiny fish and larvae to bigger fish that can escape predation. And so the juvenile sucker was important with that. Hopefully this is a video that will show of the concept of the Delta. I guess it's not going to show, is it? Anyway, there was a concept. This must be an apple. There was a concept that showed, how the lake comes up and how it goes back down and connects with Utah Lake. And I guess it'll show next time. But this is, I thought, very interesting. This is when Utah Lake was up, and the Delta water is the brownish water, and then Utah Lake was kind of much more turbid during some of these windstorms we had out there. And it's just kind of interesting how if you do create these delta-like areas, there is attenuation of nutrients. It wasn't our primary purpose, but it does happen. And this was all a historic delta where the June sucker evolved because of that diversity, because sometimes it's connected, sometimes it wasn't. And that diversity is what provides integrity for the ecosystem. And it also provides resilience against, changes in climate. So, that's what is important about the delta and creating a delta, and it's a diverse ecosystem. This is from, I believe this is the Utah Lake Authority, diagram that says, Utah Lake has come up, within half a foot of the highest levels 70 times. There's wide variety of up and down. And as was mentioned earlier, that's not the easiest thing to figure out how to make an ecosystem work when it changes that much. But that's what we have to work with. We're trying to create processes that improve it. This is the Utah Lake going down to 4482 and a half. Of course, before it started to snow. And then these just show a little bit on the bottom is closer to 4488. And you can see there's a kind of a dike there that we cut down. And then in the middle, it's a little bit higher. And then at the top, it all looks like one water body. And so it's hugely diverse, and that's a really important aspect of it. So it started snowing, a couple of years ago and raining a lot. And then you can see Utah Lake was coming on up, and it came all the way up. We had just finished the delta, or we knew it was coming because we worked closely with the district to know what's going on with the water. And we had to scramble to get the 100-year flood bermed in, and we got it in, and then the water came down and it filled it. But we had a 100-year flood flow. I believe it's around 1,800 or so, maybe 2,000 CFS that fit right within the area that we created for it. And other areas aren't quite as wide, and this is progressed since then, but that's kind of what we're providing. So again, diversity, and then changes over time. Out of 5 miles of new channel, which is 10 miles if you count both sides, we lost about 350 linear feet, and I'm not sure what percentage that is, but not very many. And so we thought that was pretty good. 100-year flood flow right after we're done. And then we had to redo just a very little bit, but it worked really well. And then, of course, Mother Nature provided for us to provide the cottonwood seeds, and we got millions of cottonwoods that came in on that flood. And so we did get some of that natural benefit and that natural process that was happening. Then, of course, we planted wetland plants out there all over the place and continue to do that. Oh, is that me? No, just kidding. We're also working on the original channel. We did diminish the flows to about 10 CFS going through the original channel. So we installed an aeration system, and we're working on that. But that's also going to be an amazing resource for flat water recreation. And you can see we can get out on that kind of down off of Center Street. These benches now are in. They'll be in this week. So we're working on piece by piece putting things together. This is the boat ramp that will be open to the public on Saturday. And so bring your boats. And it's going to be really cool. 2 miles of river that's connected to Utah Lake and isn't subject to the wind and, scary waves and things like that. So it's a really amazing resource for birds. And we also have a wildlife viewing platform that's almost done. There's bald eagle nest and a bunch of other things out there. So this just shows the progression. The different colors are each year we kind of built our way up, and luckily Utah Lake was down, because I can't imagine if it was up and we were trying to pump, an entire lake out of here. And then right after we got done, Mother Nature provided the water for us. So we have been working together with a bunch of different partners, including, funding from the bipartisan infrastructure law that got this project done. And we couldn't have done it without a lot of different people. So, Utah Lake is a great resource. and we can all benefit by having it in our area. This is 2011. There were flooding issues before. There will be flooding issues again when Utah Lake is up, and but we do provide more room for that now and for that natural process to happen. One of our workers was flying over the other day. That's what it looks like from the air about 2 weeks ago. Um, and it used to look like the stuff to the south, which is farm fields, and then you can see the high school just to the north of there. So it's going to be a great resource for education and learning and things like that too. And on water recreation is going to be a key part of it. And we got the local high school to build a June Sucker bike rack. It's getting painted right now. It's going to be placed, and we're going to have the June Sucker band out there. Yes, there is a June Sucker song, and Paula can recite it for you, but we're going to be out there this Saturday from 10 to 2, and I hope to see you out there. And it's just been great. We also have our mascot, Leroy. He'll be there, and if you have to have a reason to come down, he'll have his tie on. So, but we love the mascot there. So every day it's a new opportunity to make a difference in people's lives, and I appreciate everyone coming today, and I look forward to seeing you out there. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Eric. And for our last presentation of the day, thank you all for bearing with us and hanging in. I think we actually have some of our highest attendance within the last hour, believe it or not, which is really exciting. It's almost matching yesterday's attendance, so I'm pretty proud. But for our last presentation, we are going to have Ben Abbott with BYU talk about his initiative with Grow the Flow.
Thank you, Addy, and thank you everyone for coming. I just am really moved to see this number of people focused on the world's greatest lake. I think we all agree. Why don't we do an informal poll? You can close your eyes, set your head on the table if you want, or just leave your eyes closed. It's nice in kindergarten how we do heads up, 7 up. So I'm going to give you 3 options. Worried about the future of the lake, neutral about the future of the lake, or positive about the future of the lake. So again, yeah, everybody close your eyes. This will be completely anonymous and highly scientific. So who is feeling worried and negative about the future of Utah Lake? Raise your hands. Okay. Who is feeling neutral or unsure about the future of Utah Lake? Okay. Who's feeling positive about the future of Utah Lake? Okay. You can lower your hands. You can keep your eyes closed if you need to. It's that time of the afternoon. So it looked like maybe 15% were negative, around 15% were neutral, and the remainder, around 60%, were feeling positive about the future of the lake. Now, there are major threats ahead, right? The population is expected to double in the Utah Lake watershed in the coming decades. We're facing less stable climate, everything from changes in snowpack to the timing of precipitation. But because of the level of community involvement, I also am in that majority group that feels really positive about the future of Utah Lake, and more broadly, facing these issues of water security that are facing us across the watershed. Now, Rick mentioned the water body that connects Utah Lake and Great Salt Lake, but this is a picture of Great Salt Lake in 2022, when the lake reached its historic low. And this is the mouth of the Bear River, the largest tributary to Great Salt Lake. And there was no water reaching the lake. In just a few minutes, I want to give a sketch of that problem and then think about some connections with Utah Lake. Almost 2/3 of the lake's surface area is gone. Almost 3/4 of its water volume is gone. And we're right on the edge, teetering on ecological collapse within 5 years. And that number has been criticized, including by the governor, who called it a laughable number, a joke. Talking to scientists, biologists, hydrologists, ecologists, they think that if anything, that number is too generous. In 2022, we weren't 5 years away from collapse. We were 5 months away from total ecosystem collapse in the Great Salt Lake because the salinity was getting so high, the brine shrimp and brine flies couldn't reproduce. So an ecosystem doesn't die the way an organism does, right? It loses services slowly. So thinking about a precise point of the death of Great Salt Lake body. I imagine some of you have heard that or even had those thoughts. Well, let's talk a little bit about what's driving the collapse. The number one driver responsible for 80 to 90% of the lake's collapse is that we are using too much water. We're consuming too much water. This is a pie chart showing the distribution of water consumption between agriculture, cities, industry, mineral extraction, and then the distribution network, what we lose in the time between. Now, this pie is not the gospel truth. In fact, it's quite fungible. And that, to me, is a big problem because we don't know how much water consumption is going on. In fact, most recent data challenges the kind of previous establishment number and projects that we are using twice as much water as we thought we were. So if you're trying to balance a budget, hydrology ultimately has a lot in common with your bank. If you're trying to balance your budget and even make your bank account grow, and you don't know if you're spending $20,000 a year or $40,000 a year, that's really hard to get to a stable place. So that we're working in a very time-sensitive issue, but also with limited information. If we think about what would it take to get the lake to a healthy level by the Olympics, it needs 1 million acre-feet more water per year. Now, Rachel's presentation, Central Utah, I think, really needs to be held up as an example, focusing on water conservation. Does anybody remember what's the amount of water that they've saved since 1998? I think that was the beginning number. 900,000 acre-feet in the back. So we need to save that much water, watershed-wide, each year, not cumulatively between now and the future. If we want to turn around Great Salt Lake and get it to a healthy range over the next 10 years, we're talking about a fundamental change in how we interact with water. That translates into about a 30 to 50% decrease in the consumptive water use. And when I share those numbers, I sometimes get laughed out of the room, right? Like it's totally unreasonable, right? We can't drink 30 to 50% less water, right? Which I think is really good news because it's not the water that goes down the toilet or that we shower with that is taking water away from Great Salt Lake. It's the water that we use for something else. What's that? So not drinking. Yeah. So food, agriculture for sure, but in cities, what are we using the water for? At the back, Henry? Grass. I didn't even tell him that beforehand. So grass. There's about 150,000 acre-feet of turf grass in the Great Salt Lake watershed. And if we then reduce the amount of non-functional turf grass, we're actually in striking distance of turning the corner. Great Salt Lake is not dying because we're particularly stupid in this region. In fact, Great Salt Lake is just a part of a constellation of lakes worldwide. There are 120 of these large saline lakes around the world, and virtually all of them are in decline. And we're right in the middle. Globally, we've lost 60% of this ecosystem type. So the colors represent how much the lake system is gone. You'll notice many in the 90 to 100% loss. Right? So we can rattle off on every continent these stories of ecological decline that then feed back and harm communities around those lakes. So it's a problem caused by water overuse, exacerbated by climate change. Here are two other examples, one from Iran, one from the border of Uzbekistan, the former Soviet Union. Why should we care about these lakes? Why does it matter? 3 reasons, if I had to summarize it. First, human health. In the upper right, you can see a picture of the Salton Sea in Southern California. Right? So this is a dust storm coming off of the Salton Sea, a major source of particulate pollution. It's also being deposited on the agricultural fields, right? So we see the cycle. Agriculture is the first sector of the economy to get hit when we lose a lake. That's also because these lakes produce a lot of water vapor, which we usually think of as a loss. But if we complete the water cycle, again, new research out of USU shows 50% of the rain and snow in the greater Salt Lake Valley comes from evaporation from Great Salt Lake. Imagine we lose the lake, you turn down the precipitation by 50%, and we're in a totally different bioclimatic zone. the urban forests that we love, the temperatures that we love, the weather conditions that we love, all depend on these lakes. It's the same reason why we don't want to solve the problem of reducing the size of Utah Lake, right? That's not a water loss, it's a water recycling. The second reason is habitat. There are about 12 million migratory birds that depend on the Great Salt Lake system. And if we lose the lake, that will impact the whole Western Hemisphere. Finally, economy got covered up there by the picture. The lake directly produces between $2 and $3 billion of economic activity each year. And the indirect estimates, the indirect economic impacts haven't been estimated. Nobody has dared say, what would it do to property values? What would it do to the ski industry? What would it do to the reputation of Utah? So the stakes are high. And I really do believe this is the most important environmental and cultural challenge that we face today. Can we be pioneers again? And whether we talk about the first inhabitants of this region who traveled across the land bridge to get here, whether we talk about the more recent inhabitants of European descent who traveled across the plains to get here, can we do the same thing again? Can we pioneer a new relationship with water? Or will Great Salt Lake go the way of all of these other lakes? And that's why I believe this really is a reflection of our values more than anything else. We have plenty of water here. We're not Johannesburg, South Africa, or Las Vegas, Nevada. We're subsidizing activities from grass to alfalfa that are using too much water. But it's going to take a fundamental change, and that's what we're working on. I'm going to just skip ahead here. One comment. So this is a graph showing elevation of Great Salt Lake. It's really nice when a rich aunt dies and you inherit some money. Sorry if that's insensitive. But that's not a way to balance your account in the long term, right? You've got to bring consumption below what's coming in. We have to learn to live within our means. And we're either going to do it the hard way or the harder way, right? The hard way is figuring out how can we rework water law? How can we work together with farmers and urban areas to do this? But I think that we have a beautiful example right behind us with Utah Lake. Again, it looks like that got, I'll just leave it here. With Utah Lake, there was an existential threat to this ecosystem, right? Developers wanted to build the world's largest artificial islands on the lake, and they even called it a solution to the problem with Great Salt Lake, right? It's going to reduce the lake area, and then we'll be able to ship that water down to Great Salt Lake. They never described how the water rights would be transferred or any of the 1,000 other problems. But the community came together at a symposium just like this, in fact, in the same room. And from that little nugget grew a movement of people reconnecting with the lake. Now, that was not the only thread, right? We have examples going back decades. Think of the June Sucker Recovery Implementation Program. Absolutely a visionary program of people working together. We need to do the same thing with Great Salt Lake. And so we need a bigger group of people. It took 10,000 people focused on Utah Lake to turn the tide and stop that bad project. We need around 100,000 people. I got a call the other day that said, the solution is saran wrap. We can just stretch saran wrap across the lake bed, right? And then the dust won't be there. And then when water lands on the saran wrap, it'll flow off into the lake. And I asked him to calculate how much of the annual supply of saran wrap it would take to do that, because it's 800 square miles of exposed lake bed. And it's only about a third of the saran wrap we use each year in the US. So really that may be a solution. We welcome all of the ideas out of the box and in the box, but we know from global examples that the only pathway forward that is fast enough and that co-benefits instead of side effects is conservation. We need to reduce the amount of water we're consuming. All the other things, from pipelines, cloud seeding to everything else, they may play a part of the solution in the long term, but they're all years to decades out. And what we can do this year is use less water. So I invite you all to join the movement. It's going to benefit Utah Lake, it'll benefit Great Salt Lake, and lay the foundation for sustainable flourishing here in this region, which I really think is a wonderful legacy to leave. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Ben. That was great. I'm happy to invite everyone for questions now. We are not on time. Sorry, everybody. I may have lied. But we would love to take any questions for these awesome presenters. Man, maybe kind of working. Why aren't these working? Anyways, as I was saying, we would love to get the same amount of questions for this panel. So if you have any great ones, we would love to pass it on to them.
So, broadening our perspective beyond just Utah Lake and even Great Salt Lake, Rachel discussed import water from the Colorado River Basin, and I would love to hear any of your guys' thoughts on the long-term sustainability of relying on the Colorado River Basin, which also has its own dewatering issues, in fixing the water shortage issues that we have here in Utah.
I'll probably have to take that one. So it's an interesting challenge that we're kind of facing, especially Central Utah Water Conservancy District, where we do supply water in the Great Salt Lake Basin, but also have the declining Colorado River issues at bay. We are also facing significant challenges on the Colorado River as well, and that can impact the available water that we will have for the Central Utah project and for delivery to the Wasatch Front. And so we really do have this on both ends in terms of where our water supply comes from, and in addition to the demand that we're getting in the Wasatch Front. And there's been significant actions done by the state recently, a lot of water modeling and a lot of negotiations with the post-26 negotiations between the upper and lower basin states. One of the biggest issues with the Colorado River is not the upper basin states consumption. It is actually the lower basin states consumption. Right now we are sitting, I'm trying to remember exactly. We have been sending over 9 million acre feet over the 10-year average down to the lower basin, and they have a 1.5 million acre foot structural deficit that they need to address, and it's just been challenging just to get that resolved. So it's a good question. If we do drop before 82.5 over 10 or 75 over 10 in the next coming years, which there is some projections if we do keep having a drought, there are some projections that we could be hitting that. We're going to have some issues on the Colorado River in terms of water supplies.
I just want to mention that also, we have overused some of the groundwater we have in places. And as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, having plans in place. So with high and hello, both, in high years and low years, and being able to, adjust to that with our personal habits and our practices each day. You might not have your lawn quite as nice and things like that. So there are choices we can each make, in dry years and wet. So those are just some things to consider. And then how we decide to use water, for, as was mentioned, a lot of the water or some of the water goes to June sucker to keep, the sucker alive on the earth. And so, that's a human value. And a lot of these are human values, human health, economic health, and all those things have.
I think it's you, Eric. I think you're making the microphone spritz. I think I saw a hand up here. Bev, did you have your hand up?
The water that is used by the people who are forced or were forced to have lawns, which the cities enforced years ago, is that changing now? I understand it's changing some, but if you changed it in all the cities, that would make a huge difference.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. We shouldn't have any ordinances requiring people to put in turf grass. And yet we see a lot of variability. There are over 100 municipalities, so cities, in the watershed, And about 70% of them don't have water conservation plans, right? So there can be helpful things, but this is something that each of us can do. Call your city council member and say, what are we doing as a city to live within our means, to conserve water, right? We don't want water rates to go up. We want the environment to stay healthy. I think that that's a point of action we really should focus on.
So, what would happen? I have two questions. So, what would happen if Utah Lake disappeared, and if we didn't? And the second one is, what would happen if we didn't? If we didn't water our lawns?
So I don't know if I have to take it. Yeah, does Dad have to take?
No. I don't think it would be very good for any of us if Utah Lake disappeared. There may be some issues with blowing dust. I think we all realize that healthy ecosystems lead to healthy communities, and that's why it is important that we do these things just for a fish. It's actually for people as well. It's important that we have that integrity. Um, as far as lawns, it would I think having turf that is usable is important to some of the community values that we have. But the turf that isn't necessarily used as much. It also requires maintenance, and there's some trade-offs. There's certainly trade-offs. I think we definitely need to consider our urban forests and how much great shade that they provide. And I'll just leave it at that.
I think we're going to be in a pretty bad hydrologic scenario if Utah Lake disappears. Utah Lake is actually a vital reservoir for drinking water in Salt Lake County. Not only does it utilize the exchange for Jordanelle that provides drinking water to Salt Lake County, but there's additional exchanges that are utilized by other big municipalities. Like Lake City uses Utah Lake water for exchange to the Six Water Creeks, as well as Jordan Valley Water Conservancy District utilizing it for exchange with the Provo Reservoir Water Users Company. And so those are very key drinking water sources. And it's something that people don't think about when they look at Utah Lake because of the algal blooms. It is a very crucial exchange body of water and provides a ton of drinking water for the state.
Stunned them.
How do you reconcile the need to conserve water with the projected population growth?
There's a really interesting dynamic there. Maximum consumptive water use in the watershed was actually in the 1990s. Since that time, the population has doubled, and the overall amount of water we're consuming has slightly decreased. And that maybe seems impossible, right? But where are the cities growing into? Farmland, right? And even if you cover a agricultural field with turf grass, you're not using as much water as was being used there before. And there are reasons. So this idea of trade-off, it doesn't mean that we want to convert all farmland into cities, right? But the net effect of population growth has actually been to decrease the amount of water consumed. It's not going to get us there fast enough, right? But it shows that we are able to have a different path forward. The per capita water use has decreased nominally over that time period. Let's just do that again. We got to figure out how to do it faster.
All right, we have time for maybe one more question. Give it a chair lick in the back.
Are there any effects of the salinity of the Colorado River water in the system?
I almost think I need to look at my water quality people that are sitting over in the back corner to answer that question. Oh, here comes Mike. I'm sorry, Mike. I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
So the Colorado River water that's brought into the system
is diverted up high in the Colorado River watershed in the Uintas. So it doesn't have the same salinity issues that you see on the lower Colorado. It's a lot more similar to water on this side of the Great Basin watershed with low salinity.
Thanks, Mike.
All right. Well, I think that wraps up all the questions we have. Thank you guys so much for answering them. You guys did a great job. And I would love to pass the mic to Lou Peterson to give us some closing remarks, but please applause for the guys. I hope this one will work.
All right. In the interest of not having this die on me in the middle of lengthy remarks, I'm not going to give any. Thank you all for coming to the symposium. Would really appreciate your time, taking the time out of your schedules to join us. And I've really enjoyed my time here. Thank you all for coming. Please stay in contact with us, with the Utah Lake Authority, and we'll see you soon, I hope.